Ukraine is about to receive a revolutionary weapon system that could redefine drone warfare, the Australian-developed Slinger. You've seen the devastating impact of drones in countless news reports and social media videos, wreaking havoc on buildings, vehicles, soldiers, and infrastructure. The Slinger system promises to turn the tide in the battle against swarms of low-tech lethal drones. But what makes the system so special? How does it work? And why is it so desperately needed on the Ukrainian front lines? Stay with us as we uncover the cutting-edge technology behind the Slinger, its unparalleled capabilities, and the strategic advantage it offers Ukraine in this high-stakes conflict. But to understand how the Slinger can turn the tide in Ukraine, let's first delve into its impressive technical specifications and capabilities. Developed by Australian defense company Electro-Optic Systems, the Slinger counter-drone system offers an elegantly simple yet highly effective solution to a complex problem. Weighing just over 700 pounds, this self-contained unit is a formidable drone killer. Its primary weapon, a 30mm M230LF Bushmaster chain gun, is complemented by a Belgian-made FN Mag 58 7.62 caliber machine gun. With a 150-round ammunition drum for the chain gun and customizable belted ammunition for the machine gun, the Slinger is ready for action. If fired simultaneously, the chain gun can shoot up to 200 rounds a minute, and the FN Mag 58 can shoot around 650 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That's quite a bit of lead going downrange toward a cheap quadcopter. But that's not all the Slinger can do. Beyond its robust armament, the Slinger boasts cutting-edge detection technology that ensures no drone goes unnoticed. Equipped with advanced detection tools, the Slinger can pinpoint potential drone threats with precision. Its four-dimensional sensor unit continuously emits lasers to measure distances accurately, working in tandem with its primary radar to find, fix, track, and destroy enemy drones. At the heart of the Slinger is the American-made EchoGuard electronically scanned array radar. This revolutionary radar system, typically found in much larger, standalone units, has been miniaturized for compact use. The EchoGuard excels in finding, classifying, and tracking targets of virtually any size under almost any weather. Utilizing unique onboard software capabilities that assist the EchoGuard in differentiating even the smallest and fastest moving of targets, little can escape its gaze. But how does the radar work? As a phased array radar, it sends energy pulses in one direction at a time. These pulses coincide with the maximum area of coverage the radar can see and happen so fast it can give data throughout its whole field of view as close as possible to real time. For the EchoGuard, it operates in the K-band frequency range of 24.05 and 24.65 GHz. This incredibly high frequency range is great for producing high-fidelity data at short ranges, just what the Slinger needs to do. In addition to having this great data while tracking enemy drones, the operator can set the radar to a 10 Hz search while tracking function even while the Slinger is engaging a target. This is a very valuable capability, since it allows the operator not to get sucked into the current problem and able to look ahead for the next threat constantly. Another great feature of this radar is its field of view, with the ability to scan up to 80 degrees high in the air with a 120-degree cross-section. The EchoGuard radar can provide more than enough coverage for the Slinger's own field of view, which is up to 70 degrees straight up and 10 degrees down. But how does the gun stay on target when shooting from a moving platform? Thanks to a gimbal system, the Slinger can stay on target no matter the shooter's speed or drone speed to within 1 milliradian. A milliradian is 1,000th of a radian, the angle that intercepts an arc equal to the circle's radius. In plain language, this means that the margin of error for the Slinger is so small, it's almost not even measurable. But how far can the Slinger really see? EOS testing data reveals that the Slinger can detect targets over 12,000 meters away with its daylight camera and more than 13,700 meters with its thermal imaging camera. While this information is sufficient for radar registration, high-quality firing solutions are achieved within 5,600 meters for daylight and 5,100 meters for thermal imaging. For higher quality data that can be used to actually shoot something down, a potential drone would need to fly within 5,600 meters of the daylight camera and 5,100 meters of the thermal imager. Once inside this range, the Slinger can begin engaging the target since the operator has enough information to know the drone's bearing, range, and speed. If the drone closes another 500 meters, the operator can even tell the exact make, model, and type of drone. However, drones are only one of the targets the Slinger can engage. Because of the multi-threat environment in which the Slinger system will operate, drones are not the only adversaries the operator might need to contend with. From operational testing of the system, the Slinger can accurately detect and engage vehicles at distances of over 3.5 kilometers, enemy soldiers at 2.2 kilometers, and some of the most common, smallest quadcopters at distances of just over a kilometer. Rounding out the Slinger system's main parts are a few other sensors and pieces of equipment that help it to operate. One of these is a wind sensor mounted on the top right of the unit that continually feeds wind data into the Slinger's algorithm. Controlling the Slinger is a 50-pound control unit situated inside the vehicle. This control unit is almost like a video game, where a user can accurately find, fix, and engage targets with the push of a button. Now that we've gone over a good bit of the technical details of the system, the question still remains of how the Slinger is so effective at shooting down small drones. The answer to that question is not what you think. Before Electro-Optic Systems became a defense company, it was a trailblazer in Australia's space industry, pioneering the best way to track objects in near-Earth orbit up to 36,000 kilometers. But how are they able to do this, and why track objects in space? According to recent data, there are more than 29,000 pieces of space debris larger than 10 centimeters, 670,000 more than a centimeter, and a staggering 170 million pieces of space junk larger than a millimeter. And all of this space junk is not just standing still. All the debris is flying around in near-Earth orbit at speeds of around 18,000 miles per hour, about 7 times that of a bullet. When combined with the fact that around 6,000 satellites are orbiting the Earth at any given time, keeping track of this enormous amount of space debris becomes a big issue. Even the smallest piece of junk hitting one of these satellites could be catastrophic. EOS came into the field to help solve this problem. Founded about 40 years ago, the company has become Australia's and one of the world's leading experts in tracking small, fast-moving objects around the Earth. While the company does a lot of research to explore deep space, the primary focus has been crafting cutting-edge lasers and optics that can measure these very small but extremely fast-moving objects within 1 millimeter of accuracy. Because of the decades of experience in doing this line of work, it's no wonder that Slinger was a natural transition for the company to go from space exploration to defense products. Essentially, the technology on Slinger has been in development for decades in the space industry, and the company is now miniaturizing this technology to become a drone's worst nightmare. But of course, the company needs more than just powerful lasers and cool optics to track this fast space debris. It also needs extremely powerful software programs. While the exact capabilities of Electro-Optic Systems' computer algorithms are kept under wraps as a company secret, they are without a doubt powerful. After all, with their lasers tracking tens of millions and potentially more than 100 million objects at any given time of the day, the amount of data that the company is processing is, for lack of a better word, astronomical. To then be able to take this massive amount of raw data, sort it, process it, and then have a usable product in real time within a millimeter of accuracy takes some serious computing power. For Slinger, this software is at the heart of its capabilities. With the ability to intake a huge amount of data from its EchoGuard radar, Slinger then needs to make sense of this information on very small, fast-moving targets in real time for the operator to actually engage them. But how is Slinger adapted from a cool science project to military use? According to press releases from the company, the beauty of the Slinger is that it can be modified to practically anything with wheels. While the official contract Ukraine signed for 160 units has 110 being fitted to M113 armored personnel carriers and 50 going to Bushmaster 4x4 trucks, the Slinger can be fitted to almost any type of vehicle. When EOS showed off Slinger's capabilities at the firing range with live drones, operators fired the unit from Denali pickup trucks. With the ability to turn everything from a simple pickup truck to an armored vehicle to a tank into a mobile drone point defense system, Slinger's utility is really only limited by the operator's imagination. So why is the Slinger really needed in Ukraine? Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the type of fighting has been ever-changing. Due to the absolutely massive casualties the Russians suffered in both terms of soldiers and material, they began looking for ways to preserve their combat power. As for Ukraine, since they've remained the underdog in this fight from the beginning, across all metrics like number of personnel, equipment, and economy size, they too have sought to expand their combat power in a realistic way. In the end, both sides ended up choosing drones to meet their respective needs. But how bad has drone warfare gotten? According to reports from the battlefield, the use of drones has become absolutely critical to how both sides fight this war. They perform a wide variety of functions on both sides. The first and most obvious of these is reconnaissance. Both Russia and Ukraine have bought or developed their own reconnaissance drones. This is because of the depth of Ukraine's air defenses and the strength of Russia's air force. Neither side can get an advantage in the skies. Because of this, both sides rely heavily on reconnaissance drones, since if they get shot down, it's much better price to pay than a multi-million-dollar aircraft and pilot. While reconnaissance drones like Ukraine's UKR jet or Russia's Orlan do a lot of the long-range reconnaissance that is then fed back to higher headquarters, both sides also use larger attack drones. Russia has famously buddied up with Iran to procure thousands of so-called kamikaze Shahid drones, which are meant as one-time use drones that fly at fast speeds and pack a huge punch. To date, Russia has employed more than 4,000 such drones in its illegal conquest of Ukraine. Ukraine has also developed or procured a wide variety of armed drones. Most famously, it's used the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone and the domestically produced UKR jet UJ-22 biplane. But while these attack drones and loitering munitions have played a huge part in the fighting, their use is underscored by an even bigger threat: first-person view drones. Known for short as FPV drones, these small drones are the true menace on the battlefields of Ukraine. They serve various functions. The first of these roles is to serve as local reconnaissance drones. With a range of 5 to 20 kilometers, these small drones are perfect for local company-sized units to have their own intelligence-gathering tool at all hours of the day. In addition to this role, both Ukrainian and Russian artillery units use FPV drones to help spot their fires. While traditionally a forward observer would be embedded with forward units to report what he saw, now a forward observer can get a top-down view in real time and correct fires without playing a game of telephone on the radio. But despite these advantages, the true terror in FPV drones comes in their bomb-dropping capabilities. Both sides employ huge drone manufacturing capabilities dedicated to making small FPV drones or using money to buy civilian quadcopters on the open market. Dotted across Ukraine are hundreds of ad hoc factories set up in abandoned homes, hospitals, and bunkers where Ukrainian volunteers use a variety of methods to not only cobble together FPV drones from open-source parts, but also modify munitions like anti-tank grenades, regular hand grenades, RPG warheads, and mortar shells so they're able to be dropped from these small drones. For Russia's part, they too have hundreds if not thousands of factories both inside occupied Ukraine and inside Russia producing FPV drones on a similar scale. To put some of the numbers into perspective, the Ukrainian government has set a target of 1 million FPV drones to be domestically produced in the country in 2024. This number does not include the huge numbers of FPV drones Ukraine buys on the open market or that are donated by allied countries every day. Both sides of the conflict use FPV drones for a variety of purposes. They use them to target and take out tanks, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and worst of all, harass and kill unsuspecting individual soldiers anytime, anywhere. Due to the complete proliferation of FPV drones, coming up with ways to take them out has been a priority for Ukraine. But this has been easier said than done. While Ukraine has been provided with some of the West's most capable anti-air systems, they are not necessarily the best choice for taking out drones. For example, the US Patriot and NASAMS systems, along with European weapons like the Iris-T, are all incredibly powerful, accurate, and versatile anti-air defenses. The only problem is, they're costly to operate. With a unit cost running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per missile, every time Ukraine fires the weapon, there could be millions of dollars spent per engagement. When firing against Shahid drones with a unit cost in the tens of thousands of dollars, or worse, against an FPV drone with a price in the thousands or even hundreds of dollars, using these highly capable air defense systems is a sunken cost fallacy that Ukraine is on the wrong side of. To counteract wasting precious ammunition on drones meant to exhaust Ukraine's missile supplies and stop the flow of expensive Western aid into the war zone, Ukraine's Western backers have provided a variety of other anti-air systems that the country has put to good use. For example, Germany's legacy Gepard and newer Skynex air defense systems have been donated and proven useful on the battlefield. Utilizing high-capacity autocannons to shoot down short-range, fast-moving targets, these vehicles have downed significant numbers of drones. However, at only around 50 total units operational, these are just a drop in the bucket for what's needed. Ukraine's Western backers have also provided a variety of other air defense systems explicitly geared for drone defense. For example, Lithuania has donated thousands of Skywiper electronic drone mitigation systems. These small portable units are great for point defense of local units that can keep them in a vehicle or trench due to weighing just 14 pounds. The Skywiper works by jamming the radio frequency signals the operator sends to control the drone. But while these systems are great for protecting smaller areas within 3 miles, visible drones outside this range are not susceptible to their effects. Even worse, due to the increased number of GPS jammers on the battlefield, Russia has been hardening its own weapons to become even more jam-resistant, lessening the usefulness of such tools. Another counter-drone system that Ukraine has utilized is the Terrahawk Paladin counter-drone system. Adapted from MSI's Navy variant for land use, the Terrahawk is very similar to Germany's Skynex. Utilizing a powerful autocannon, it's designed to perform point defense in an area of up to 3 kilometers, using its own radar suite. However, unlike Skynex, the Terrahawk is a static weapon, meaning it cannot move on its own and is very vulnerable to enemy counterfire. Ukraine has also not received very many of this system either. The US has also donated several drone defense weapons, including the new Vampire by L3 Harris. Of all the donated drone defense weapons, the Vampire is the most similar to the Slinger. It is its own self-contained unit fully equipped with radar and a control unit that can be mounted onto most pickup trucks. But unlike the Slinger, the Vampire has a 4-rocket pod that can fire 70mm guided rockets or similar munitions. However, despite being very similar, price and capacity are the main drawbacks. At $27,500 per rocket, the Vampire is still on the wrong side of the math equation when shooting down drones worth $500 each. Additionally, with just 4 rockets, a Vampire system could quickly run out of ammunition in a real fight where multiple drones are coming from different angles of attack. Lastly, reloading this weapon while under fire is no easy task, and when out of ammunition, the operator would likely have to egress the area to reload and get back in the fight. As one can see, though Ukraine has received a lot of Western aid, no single system can yet meet the cost-effectiveness and versatility needed when shooting down swarms of FPV drones. So what are the advantages of the Slinger over some of these systems? Arguably, one of the Slinger's best advantages is the cost. Firing 30mm and 7.62mm rounds, the Slinger can engage a huge number of drones for about a couple of $100 to $1,000 per engagement. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars of some of the advanced systems, the Slinger finally gets Ukraine on the right side of the cost equation. Another pro is that the Slinger is very adaptable to whatever platform the Ukrainians need it to go on. Currently, larger air defense systems like the Patriot come with several modules, including the firing unit, radar, command post, and other containers. These containerized systems cannot move quickly on the battlefield. For other legacy systems like Gepard and Skynex, these systems can cost millions of dollars, plus have expensive maintenance to keep the vehicles operational. Additionally, getting a replacement in the field is tough if the vehicle takes any substantial battle damage. On the other hand, Slinger is much more versatile, in that it can be mounted on a pickup truck, tank, or armored personnel carrier, or in a static position. With the ability to quickly displace and be replaced due to its low cost of around $1 million, the Slinger beats out the other mobile platforms. Because the Slinger system is so small, its radar cross-section and energy are much lower than those of other air defense systems. Countries like Russia have developed a wide range of emission-seeking munitions that look for radar energy from an air defense site and home in on it. However, because the energy output from this system only goes a few kilometers and is very small, when operating, Slinger is practically invisible to Russian aircraft unless they are right over the top, which would be a whole other problem in and of itself. But despite these pros, there are a few disadvantages to the system that could eventually give the Russians a way to defeat it. One way is its ability to integrate into Ukraine's overall air defense network. Due to the limited range of its radar, the firing unit would have to be able to share data with assets that have a longer range in order to be forewarned for incoming attacks. Not having this capability to share data can leave operators vulnerable and surprised by massed Russian attacks. This ties directly into the Slinger's next con. In Ukraine, it's been increasingly common for Russia to employ ever-increasing numbers of drones in multi-axis attacks against Ukrainian positions. Though the live-fire demonstrations in Australia were impressive, it should be noted that these were all single drone engagements. Though Slinger could very well encounter single FPV drones since they're so common, it's increasingly more common to see multiple drones at one time. How Slinger will fare against these multi-threat engagements may only be known when Ukraine uses it on the battlefield. But despite these cons, Slinger will undoubtedly be a game-changer on the battlefield, filling a hole in Ukraine's air defense network. But what do you think? Do you think the Slinger will change the dynamics of drone warfare on the battlefield? Let us know in the comments below. Also, tell us what other military technologies you're interested in learning about. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more expert military analysis and updates. In a stunning move that has left Moscow reeling, Sweden has delivered a crippling blow to Russian forces, shifting the tides of the conflict in Ukraine. This unprecedented aid package from Sweden, NATO's newest member, marks a historic departure from its traditional stance of neutrality. What secret strategies and cutting-edge technologies has Sweden unveiled to support Ukraine? How will this affect the balance of power in the region? Let's delve into the dramatic developments that have sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and bolstered Ukraine's fight for freedom. On May 29th, Sweden announced its 16th aid package to Ukraine. Tellingly, this was primarily a military rather than an economic or humanitarian aid package. It is designed to create Russian casualties, which would have been unthinkable for Sweden a few years ago. Such aid is a departure from Sweden's traditional foreign policy. Until Putin decided to invade Ukraine, Stockholm observed a policy of neutrality dating back to the Napoleonic Wars. The last time Sweden entered a conflict was in the Swedish-Norwegian War of 1814. The Swedish public widely supported their country's neutrality, and it was maintained during both world wars. As late as 2012, only 17% of Swedes expressed support for joining NATO. By 2021, the number increased to 46%. But Sweden was always wary of the threat from Russia. The two countries fought the long and bitter Great Northern War in the early 18th century over influence in the Baltic Sea. Sweden lost the conflict and has been on guard against Russia ever since. As early as 1904, Sweden was patrolling the Baltic with submarines to protect its coastline. That mission has given it more underwater experience in the Baltic than any other nation. The Gripen fighter was designed specifically to counter the threat from Russia. Even its radar system is designed to let it look toward Russian territory without flying in its direction. Fear of potential Russian aggression has entered Swedish cultural consciousness. Some of the older locals on Gotland Island, one of the most important locations in the Baltic and the likeliest place in Sweden that Russia would attack, reported in 2015 that they would hear stories from their parents warning that if they failed to finish their dinners, the Russians would get them. Back then, people on the island were divided over whether Swedish military should increase their presence there. No such divisions exist today. Putin's decision to invade Ukraine reawakened historical nightmares among the Swedish public and policymakers in Stockholm. Sweden announced its intention to join NATO a few months later and quickly became a partner to help Ukraine fend off the invasion. Like Germany, Sweden reversed its historical aversion to providing lethal military aid. It began with providing weapons like anti-materiel weapons, air defenses, and light vehicles. The investments increased, and Sweden demonstrated early on that it was willing to go far in its proportional investment in money and weaponry. On the first anniversary of the war, Sweden said it would donate 10 Leopard 2A5 tanks to Ukraine. Sweden's latest aid package is worth $1.23 billion. To put that into perspective, Sweden's total military spending in 2023 was $8.75 billion. Meanwhile, Sweden's total aid to Ukraine amounts to a little over $4 billion over the course of 16 packages since the invasion started. Such a proportionally large expenditure demonstrates Stockholm's threat perception. Russia's recent successes have required Stockholm to step up its spending even more. The pace of Sweden's separate aid packages also reflects Stockholm's wariness, as several have been passed in the last few months, and they have significantly increased in size. For example, in late February, Sweden announced a $682 million aid package, which was then its largest. The package included 10 CB-90 combat boats, 20 group boats, underwater weapons, $192 million worth of badly needed artillery shells, RBS-70 man-portable air defense systems, anti-tank missiles, Carl Gustaf grenade launchers, hand grenades, and medical supplies. Early in May, Sweden passed aid to help Ukraine secure its energy supply, since this section has been a particular target for Russian missiles and drones. This aid will be spent on equipment like generators, transformers, and solar cells. Will also include necessary spare parts like electrical switches, cables, pumps, and pipes. The May 29th aid package was about twice the size of the February aid package. It does not include donations of the JAS-39 Gripen fighter jet. Although Ukraine has expressed interest in this platform in the past and does not rule it out in the future, Kyiv wants to focus on implementing its F-16 program. Stockholm says that it's still working on the possibility of contributing the Gripen system later, but for now it's too much of an ask for Ukraine to divide itself between the two new fighter jet programs. Though it won't be able to donate fighter aircraft, the rest of the aid is substantial. Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister, Ebba Busch, said that the package consists of equipment that is at the top of Ukraine's priority list. Maybe the most important contribution for the immediate term is in the form of additional 155mm artillery shells. Sweden didn't specify how many shells will be provided, but the new ammunition will help to swell Ukraine's supply to well over 2 million rounds. This will ensure enough ammunition to keep Ukraine in the fight into 2025. The Swedes will also be donating RB-99 AMRAAM missiles, the equivalent of the AIM-120. Sweden's Ministry of Defense says that these missiles will be repurposed specifically to serve in ground-based anti-aircraft systems. Presumably, they'll be supplied for Ukraine's NASAMS units. This is important because Russia took to using its aviation to more effectively support its ground forces after Avdiivka fell, and the proper air support enabled Russian forces to make more rapid advances to the west. Ukraine used its NASAMS and other air defense units to shoot down some of the Russian planes. More ammunition will check Russian aviation and force Moscow to be more cautious with its air power. Sweden will also be sending its entire fleet of PBV-302 infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine. These have been retired from Swedish service as the newer Combat Vehicle 90 replaced the PBV-302 in 2014. Stockholm thought it better to donate its older vehicles rather than keep them in storage. Sweden's official announcement of the aid mentioned that the Ukrainian army was organizing several new brigades and needed armored vehicles for their infantry companies, a demand the PBV-302 will help to satisfy. The PBV-302 is armed with a 20mm cannon mounted on a turret to the vehicle's right side. The cannon can be fed with drum magazines, which can each hold 30 rounds. A 7.62mm machine gun can be used as a secondary weapon. It has armor that can withstand 20mm rounds and weighs 12.3 tons. It comes with a crew of 3, the driver, who also serves as a mechanic, the gunner, and the commander. The vehicle can carry up to 8 soldiers in its landing compartment. Over 600 of these vehicles were produced between 1966 and 2014, but that's not the amount Ukraine will receive. Much of the fleet was decommissioned from 2005 onward. By 2018, there were at least 180 still in service in various degrees of readiness. These vehicles are likely the ones Sweden will now hand over to Ukraine. The vehicles are all set to be repaired and modernized to at least some extent before the transfer. The remaining spare parts and maintenance equipment for these vehicles will be donated as part of the package, as will the 20mm shells for the onboard cannons. The PBV-302 will not be the only land vehicles Sweden donates as part of its latest package. The aid also includes surplus fuel transport vehicles in use by the Swedish Armed Forces. Previously donated Swedish material will continue to get upkeep through this aid package. Stockholm intends to help Kyiv with its command and control through donations of terminals with subscriptions for satellite communications. To help with training and military doctrine, the Swedish Defense Research Agency will assist the Ukrainian Armed Forces in creating their own Defense Research Institute. There are also a number of financial support provisions in the package. Most importantly, Sweden will make investments to ensure that Ukraine can get aid on a large scale on a rapid basis. Sweden will permit all of the weapons provided by this package to be used against targets on Russian soil if that's what Ukraine finds proper. Stockholm also claims that it will be able to replenish all of the ammunition and equipment it's sending to Ukraine through new investments. The most notable contribution in the package came in the form of 2 Saab ASCC-890 airborne early warning and control planes. Swedish Defense Minister Paul Jonsson said that these aircraft would have the most significant impact on Ukraine's air defense network. These planes will better allow Ukraine to identify and track incoming missiles and drones. They can also spot targets of opportunity for offensive operations. Training Ukrainian Air Force personnel to fly these planes is also part of the Swedish aid package. Stockholm's decision to donate these aircraft was a significant step beyond the monetary cost. These were the only 2 AWACS aircraft in Sweden's fleet. The Swedes admitted that the donation of these planes and many other provisions in the package meant a temporary vulnerability in their territorial defense. However, they decided to take what Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson called a calculated risk. Perhaps the words of his Danish counterpart, Mette Frederiksen, came to mind. Early in 2024, she pointed out that it was better for European countries to sacrifice their own arsenals temporarily to ensure Russia's defeat far from their own homelands, rather than having to potentially use those weapons against an emboldened Putin far closer to home. Sweden plans to make up for the shortage of command and control planes by purchasing additional S-106 GlobalEye aircraft. This is Saab's newest AWACS aircraft and entered service in 2020. Sweden also insists that it has plans to replenish all of the ammunition and other equipment it will lose once they arrive in Ukraine. Sweden intends to do this by increasing its defense spending. In September 2023, Stockholm announced its intention to increase its military budget by 28% for 2024. Additional increases will come in 2025 and 26. These increases will put Sweden over the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense by appropriations. The budget increases will also likely make Sweden an enduring and reliable partner for Ukraine. Stockholm has indeed already announced that its partnership with Ukraine will be for the long haul. On May 23rd, Prime Minister Kristersson said that Sweden will be providing Ukraine with $7 billion in aid over the course of 3 years to repel the invasion. The package released to Ukraine the following week was only the first of multiple packages to come, and those packages will likely get bigger as time goes on. Thanks to the increases in Sweden's military budget over the coming years, the country will be in position to deliver on this planned aid. The Ministry of Defense officially announced major planned investments in artillery systems and transport aircraft as part of the domestic defense spending program. These investments will put Sweden in a position to produce and deliver the weapons and ammunition Ukraine needs in the coming years. But how does Sweden's recent and coming aid impact Ukraine's ability to win the war of attrition? In December 2023, a report by the Estonian Ministry of Defense indicated that Ukraine could win the war in 2025 if it killed or maimed 100,000 Russian troops in 2024. While Russia has the ability to call many more soldiers than that to its colors, these people need to be trained properly and then assigned to a cohesive unit if they are to be effective on the battlefield. These units would quickly suffer casualties, creating even more demand for manpower that would in turn send troops to the front with even less training. It will be a vicious cycle that Russia, even with its much greater amount of available manpower than Ukraine, would not be capable of meeting. The Estonians estimated that if Ukraine met the 100,000 benchmark, it could reduce Russian training capacity to 80,000 properly trained troops per year. The rest would be ineffective cannon fodder. Sweden's donation, especially with the new artillery shells, will help Ukraine to achieve this objective. Since Ukraine killed or maimed an average of 172,000 Russian troops in each of the first 2 years of the war, this seems like it will be achievable, particularly with help from countries like Sweden. There is another side to this equation though. Ukraine must minimize its own losses, and that's where Sweden's recent aid package might make the most impact in the long run. Estonia's Ministry of Defense said that it was just as important to level up the training Ukrainian troops received from their Western allies. Over 100,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained by their Western allies since the war began. The training is not equal though. While most Western militaries have basic training courses that take 10 weeks, and then several months for more specialized tasks like demolition or sniping, most of the Ukrainian troops in the war have had only 5-week courses. Ukrainian troops have also sometimes complained that they have received improper training from their NATO allies, which have been influenced too heavily by the war on terror rather than the high-intensity state-based warfare that's taking place in Ukraine. This lack of adequate training has also ensured that Ukraine suffered about 200,000 casualties in the first 2 years of the war. Of particular importance is better training for Ukraine's officers. The Estonians recommended that foreign trainers should subject Ukrainian staff officers to a 10-week intensive training course. That way, Ukraine will be able to conduct proper operations at the brigade level. The current Ukrainian military can't do this at the moment, which is why most operations in the war have taken place at the platoon or company level. This approach to warfare has helped to keep Ukrainian armed forces nimble, but it's also had severe limitations. The Estonian Ministry of Defense pointed out these limitations. The effective span of control of a brigade for offensive operations is therefore approximately 2 companies. The result is that the Ukrainian military plans and executes operations with a horizon of exploitation limited to approximately 1,200 meters. This assessment may have been one of the more understated reasons why the offensive in Zaporizhzhia last year failed, even though Ukraine was able to penetrate 2 of Russia's formidable defensive lines there. It could not translate those gains into a bigger breakthrough because of Russian mines and improved artillery fire, but also because it simply could not effectively use the necessary amount of troops to conduct operations at the level required. Russia was able to summon reinforcements with helicopter support that halted the momentum of Ukraine's troops. Being able to bring more of them forward in a cohesive operation could have made the difference in generating the necessary momentum. Unfortunately for Kyiv, this was not available, but Sweden might be starting to change that. Sweden's assistance in creating a defense research institute for Ukraine could help with training its staff officers, preventing casualties, and ensuring more comprehensive operations at the brigade level, although this will take time to see results. It is time that Putin thinks he has on his side, but Sweden's coming aid sends the message that he might be wrong. Ukraine is well on the way to killing or maiming 100,000 Russians this year, even though its forces may have been slowly giving ground. The end of Ukraine's shell hunger, partially with the ammunition Sweden is set to deliver, will help ensure Ukraine stays in the fight for the war of attrition and can get past the contentious American presidential election. Sweden has emerged from over 200 years of military neutrality with surprising speed, and while there may be doubts about the feasibility of continuing to aid Ukraine in the United States, in Sweden there are none. Sweden doesn't have the luxury of an ocean to separate it from its old enemy. For Stockholm, it's better to defeat Russia on foreign soil than potentially need to defeat it on soil or in waters close to home. Even proportionally large investments and temporary depletion of domestic arsenals have not dissuaded Sweden's leaders from this opinion. Putin may hope that many of the countries that now oppose him will become exhausted with Ukraine over time and lose interest in continuing the effort. For deep historical reasons, Sweden is unlikely to be one of those countries, and that's important because it might be proportionally small, but it has a strong defense industry. It will also look bad if Sweden, the newest member of NATO and also one of its smaller participants, were to continue supporting Ukraine at significant cost to itself while the others did nothing. Sweden's support helps to ensure a broader European effort that could continue onward even if American aid falters. Sweden's historic decision to step up and deliver a significant blow to Russia through its aid packages marks a new chapter in the conflict. As NATO's newest member, Sweden's support highlights the unwavering commitment of Ukraine's allies to ensure regional stability and security. What impact will Sweden's aid have on the war dynamics? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain: Ukraine is not alone in its fight for freedom. What do you think of the support Sweden has lent to Ukraine throughout the war, and how will it affect Kyiv's ability to win the war of attrition? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out Australia just dealt Russia a crushing blow, or click this other video instead. Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started, and with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple: what happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's foreign minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia. Even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas, and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine, he knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict, and with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck two facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and Norsy factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The Norsy factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict. And yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says, "It could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent." In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in all-in aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains. Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do, using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means, he said before adding, even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack. In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course, you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? Let us know what you think, and tell us what impact Ukraine having permission to launch attacks within Russian territory, at least from a handful of its partners, will have on the war. We look forward to checking out your comments, and thank you for watching the video. The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its third year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment, that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defense issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing on to Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too, as it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality. Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made Caesar self-propelled howitzer. The Caesar entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The Caesar fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell, ERFB. These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the Caesar is nevertheless capable of firing it. The Caesar can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each Caesar costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 Caesar howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The Caesar has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its Caesar guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the Caesar was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of Caesar units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 Caesars comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 Caesar units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its Caesar artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Frederiksen's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the Caesar units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardon mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardon was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordom is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cordom operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cordom has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cordom mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cordom systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cordom's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cordom in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cordom mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cordom to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counter-terrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer. When the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive, the expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Fredriksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Fredriksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia can't stop US weapons, or click this other video instead. Ukraine has been on a knife edge in its war with Russia over the last year. During that time, it's been forced to confirm that its counteroffensive, which was designed to push Vladimir Putin's troops back, had failed, and it's been gradually losing territory to the Moscow steamroller. Russia has been taking ground. Avdiivka represents perhaps the largest victory for Putin over the last year of the war. The city, which Ukraine had transformed into a fortress, fell in 2024 after Moscow committed wave after wave of attack beginning in October 2023. Putin hailed the taking of Avdiivka as being hugely important for Russia, not least because controlling the city means Ukraine loses its main route into Donetsk. Along with that victory, Russia has made some serious inroads into Bakhmut, as well as taking several villages around Zaporizhia. Some commentators say there's now a stalemate on the front lines. That's not the case. Russia is advancing thanks to its ability to constantly bombard Ukrainian positions with artillery and troops. The war of attrition has been playing out in Putin's favor, not least of which because he has the funds to support his war effort at a time when Ukraine has started to run low. But that's all changed. And with that comes the possibility that Ukraine could be on the verge of destroying Putin's ambitions. All of which brings us to the key questions we'll answer in this video. What's the seismic change that's happened that will allow Ukraine to finally push back against Russia? And perhaps more crucially, what does this mean for Putin's ambitions, not just in Ukraine, but the rest of Europe? The answer to the first of those questions is simple. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have approved massive aid packages that are going to be a major help to Ukraine in the months to come. We'll start with the UK's package. On April 23, 2024, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak travelled to Poland for a meeting in which he aimed to strengthen the country's security ties with one of Europe's emerging military nations. During that meeting, he announced that the UK had approved a £500 million, approximately $620 million, aid package that would account for the country's largest ever delivery of military equipment to a wartime ally. The announcement brought the UK's funding total in Ukraine up to $3.7 billion for the financial year, with most of the money going toward funding equipment that Ukraine desperately needs to fend off the Russian offensive. Among that equipment will be 60 boats, including raiding craft, dive boats, and maritime guns that can be used both to fend off any Russian naval offenses as well as provide Ukraine with options for making inroads into Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. The UK will also provide 400 military vehicles split between 78 all-terrain vehicles, 160 Husky vehicles, which come with protective armor, and a further 162 armored vehicles of different types. Plus, the UK will bolster Ukraine's missile stocks. The money will pay for 1,600 air defense and strike missiles that may help Ukraine deal with Russia's constant bombardments. Add to that a small number of Storm Shadow long-range guided missiles, which are capable of traveling for about 150 miles, providing Ukraine with the ability to strike Russian targets from a great distance, and you have a comprehensive equipment package. And that's not all. The UK will also provide Ukraine's ground soldiers with 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, as well as support from its engineering industry. There's also mention of supplying drones in the press release announcing the aid package. The UK's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps was bullish when speaking about the package, pointing out that the UK was the first to provide Ukraine with modern tanks, long-range missiles, and NLAW anti-tank missiles. Now we are going even further. We will never let the world forget the existential battle Ukraine is fighting, and with our enduring support, they will win. Those are big words. But as impressive as the UK's aid package may be, alone it would not be enough to turn the tide of war in Ukraine's favour. At best, it would give Ukraine enough ammunition to defend itself for a few more months, but more is needed for Ukraine to stand any chance of destroying Putin's hope of taking the country. Enter the United States. After months of political wrangling, the US Senate has finally approved a massive $95 billion aid package. Signed and sealed by President Joe Biden, that money will go to supporting Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, with the latter getting the lion's share of the funding. According to the BBC, it's expected that $61 billion of that money will be dedicated to providing military aid to Kyiv, making the package about 10 times the size of that being delivered by the UK. The package has been a long time coming. As Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pointed out, after more than 6 months of hard work and many twists and turns in the road, America sends a message to the entire world: we will not turn our back on you. Defense One offers more details on how Ukraine will likely spend the money. It says that $13.7 billion will go to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which works on behalf of Kyiv to procure new weapons. Another $1.6 billion will go to a similar weapons acquisition scheme, the Foreign Military Financing Program, which is overseen by the US State Department. Add to that $13.4 billion that will be used to replace weapons the US has already sent over that have since been lost in the war, along with funding for further training of Ukrainian troops, and you have a substantial aid package, albeit one that comes with a few strings attached. Those strings include provisions in the bill that the US can withdraw the funding if Ukraine doesn't spend the money in a way that the US sees as fitting. That seems unlikely. America is already working closely with Ukraine in terms of how it spends the funds, with most of it being dedicated to purchasing American equipment that Ukraine needs anyway. Ukraine can deal with that. It's also important to point out that Ukraine isn't getting all of that money, or the equipment that it will buy, in one go. Defense One says that the first tranche of weapons the US will send to Ukraine under the new aid package will have a total of $1 billion, about a 60th of the total aid. The package is likely to include anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, along with 155mm shells, armored vehicles, and long-range rockets. Unfortunately, there are no specific numbers at the time of creating this video, though it's safe to assume they'll be somewhat similar to the UK's. And there's more. Along with finally passing the bill for aid to Ukraine, the US House of Representatives has passed another bill that could be just as damaging to Putin. A bill that allows the US to seize Russian assets held in American banks before transferring them to Ukraine for its war effort. That bill still needs to make it through the Senate, but if it passes, it would represent a bold move by the United States that could see it free up around $67 billion in assets that would essentially double the aid package it's sending to Ukraine. That bill could also serve as a trigger for other nations to do the same. After all, the $67 billion in frozen assets that the US holds is just a fifth of the $300 billion plus of frozen assets held around the world. According to Russia's central bank, Moscow has around $207 billion invested in the euro, along with $37 billion invested in the British pound. There are also tens of billions of dollars invested into the Japanese yen and Canadian and Australian dollars. Imagine what would happen if the nations controlling these currencies all followed America's lead. Ukraine would suddenly have access to over $300 billion of Russia's frozen money, which it could use to fund its defense. Of course, Putin has been quick to call any type of seizure illegal and has threatened retaliation if it happens. So the fact that the US even has a bill at all, never mind one that's passed through the House of Representatives and seems to have support of key Republican Party players, suggests that the wider world is ready to take a more aggressive approach to dealing with Putin's attempts to take Ukraine. And that brings us neatly to the second question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why does the renewed aid the United Kingdom and the United States providing to Ukraine spell such bad news for Putin? There are several answers to this question, starting with the most obvious one. The aid bolsters Ukraine's defense at a time when Russia has been slowly pushing it back in a devastating war of attrition. Right now, Russia controls around 18% of Ukrainian land, which it's managed to gain by virtue of having more equipment and manpower. That equipment advantage has come to the fore in Russia's reliance on constant missile and drone barrages over Ukrainian cities, which are supplemented by its ability to send soldier after soldier into the fight with seemingly no sign of letting up. That strategy is unlikely to change in the short term. In 2024 alone, Russia has already captured 138 square miles of Ukrainian territory, and if Ukraine's defense intelligence heads are to be believed, is planning to launch a renewed offensive at some point during May 2024. That offensive will likely focus on the small town of Chaziv Yar in Donetsk. That would be bad news for Ukraine, because the capture of that town would open the way to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, two Ukrainian strongholds in the Donbas region. Chatham House also believes it's likely that Putin will intensify Russia's missile and drone strikes, focusing on Ukrainian infrastructure, logistical routes, and industrial base. All have suffered in recent months from a lack of air defenses, and it's here where we may see the tide start to turn. As part of its aid package, the United States is supposedly providing a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine, with that system being capable of shooting down many of the types of missiles that Russia will use in these attacks. Germany has also committed to sending one, with Greece and Spain also facing increasing pressure to transfer their Patriot systems to Ukraine. Add to that the money Ukraine can now access, which it would use to purchase more Patriot missile systems, along with the ammunition they require, and the country is now in a better position to defend itself against missile strikes. Why is that such bad news for Putin? It's possible that Russia might start running low on missiles if it has to start firing more to achieve the same results it enjoyed before Ukraine got access to these new Patriot systems. Back in January 2023, Ukrainian intelligence officers started to suggest that Russia was running low on its ballistic missile stocks. A Ukrainian Air Force official named Yuri Inat suggested that Moscow had fewer than 100 of its Iskander missiles left due to its repeated strikes throughout 2022, forcing it to rely on its weaker S-300 and S-400 systems. The S-300s date back to the days of the Soviet Union, making them less reliable than their supposedly dwindling modern alternatives. Their use, suggested Inat, meant that Russia must be running low on ballistic missiles. But that was over a year ago, and the barrages kept coming. Still, it highlights the equipment and munitions challenges both face in what has become the modern example of what industrialized ground warfare looks like. According to Reuters, Russia has already fired 8,000 missiles, along with sending 4,630 Shahid drones into Ukraine. It's making and buying more, but that rate of use will eventually mean Moscow starts to run low, with Ukraine being aided by its new missile defense systems to put an even more severe dent in Moscow's missile stockpiles. In short, Putin may not be able to rely on his missile barrages for as long as he would have done without the aid packages. And given that those packages include supplying Ukraine with more missiles of its own, he may also find that the ground Russia has already taken in the country could be subjected to the very same missile strategies he used to take that ground in the first place. But Putin has a workaround for that problem, one he's already been using to great effect in Ukraine: glide bombs. In an interview with the UK's Times radio station, Professor Michael Clarke, a fellow of King's College in London, discussed Russia's use of these bombs. Specifically, he highlighted the Fab 500 and Fab 1500 variants, which are capable of carrying warheads weighing 1,102 pounds and 3,306 pounds respectively. These are very old bombs. They're not equipped with the precision-guided systems that modern missiles have, though their payloads are so massive that it doesn't really matter. As long as Russia can drop the bombs in proximity of their targets, they don't need direct strikes. The bombs can still cause damage. Clarke points out that Moscow has found a way to fit small wings to these bombs, giving them the ability to glide towards a target after being dropped from an aircraft. That's been huge for Putin. One of Russia's planes can drop a glide bomb from 30,000 feet in the air while being 50 miles behind the front lines and still know that it's likely to hit its target. The bombs were crucial to Russia's taking of Avdiivka. According to Le Monde, one Ukrainian fighter said, "These bombs completely destroy any position. All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one KAB, a term used for the glide bombs. And they drop 60 to 80 pieces on us in just one day," the soldier concluded. Countering those bombs is going to be a huge challenge for Ukraine. The only thing Ukraine can really do, according to Clarke, is take out or chase off the Russian planes that are dropping the bombs in the first place. That's where the Patriot systems may come into play again, as their range is such that they can target and hit Russian planes stationed 50 miles behind the front lines, potentially taking them out of the game before they can launch their deadly payloads. Again, another huge boon for Ukraine. If it's able to get its hands on more fighter jets, the Netherlands will provide it with 6 that were previously meant for sale in the US, as of a February 2024 report. It could even take the fight to those bomb-dropping planes. These are all little steps. And given that the funding is staggered, as well as Ukraine having to wait for equipment to arrive before it can deploy it, it's likely that Russia will still manage to advance in the near term. But with the new defensive systems in place, Ukraine can stem the bleeding and potentially take advantage of Russia's munitions starting to dry up at a key point where it's receiving a fresh load of weaponry and equipment. Ukraine will also be able to counter the glide bombs, albeit only partially, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield to the point where Ukraine can hold its cities for longer. And that ability to hold for longer is another reason why the UK's and America's aid packages could destroy Putin's ambitions. It will lead to Russia losing more soldiers. In his interview, Clarke highlights that Russia is still losing around 900 soldiers per day to a Ukraine that is war-weary and running out of equipment. It's been able to sustain those losses because of the sheer size of its army. According to Global Firepower, Russia ranks 5th in the world for active military personnel with 1.32 million, and it has 2 million reservists along with 250,000 paramilitary members. Moscow won't run out of people anytime soon. Its problem comes in funneling those huge numbers into Ukraine, which has become a slightly easier task now it controls territory in the country. But even with that territory, losing 900 people per day is a massive burden. Now that Ukraine has enough money to purchase more artillery shells and small arms ammunition, its ground troops will be able to kill even more of Putin's soldiers. That doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine will be able to force a counterattack with this funding, according to Clark. But it does mean that Russia will be forced to sustain higher losses than it has over the last few months, potentially weakening its hold on territory it's taken during 2023 and the first part of 2024. In short, Ukraine now has what it needs to start pushing Russia back. And that gives Ukraine two things that it hasn't had in a long time: breathing room and the ability to plan for the future. Now that it's better able to fend off attacks, Ukraine's frontline forces won't be in the state of panic and chaos that Russia has placed them under for much of 2024. They'll be able to launch coordinated attacks with the equipment to back them up, as well as better coordinate their defenses against Russian assaults. Clark speculates that this could slow down the Russian advance to the point where the war returns to the stalemate position it seemed to be during the beginning of 2023, giving Ukraine valuable time to plan how to use its new resources both to defend and attack. As for the control issue, Ukraine now has stability in terms of knowing what's coming in and where. It knows that the UK is going to deliver 60 boats, 400 vehicles, and 1,600 missiles, with that knowledge allowing it to plan ahead on how to maximize that equipment rather than being in a position where it has to constantly scramble to react to Russian attacks. The same will go for America's military aid package. It all feeds into giving Ukraine more control in the conflict and buoys the morale of troops that have been seeing their supplies constantly dwindling over the past year. That's not what Putin wants. As Clark points out in the Radio Times interview, Putin's strategy has been to slowly put the squeeze on Ukraine by forcing it to face up to what felt like insurmountable odds. He knew Ukraine was running low on equipment. All he had to do was keep pushing, slowly but surely, perhaps to the point where he could force a political crisis in the country. That crisis may have been the ousting of Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and opening the door to a new leader who was sympathetic to Putin's ambitions. A leader who might hand over the territory Russia has already captured to keep the peace. That's not going to happen anymore, at least not for the next year, according to Clark. He highlights these new aid packages could restore Ukraine to the point where it's again able to expend the 10,000 artillery shells it was using to keep Russia at bay near the beginning of the war, creating a stalemate situation again right as Russia looks set to push deeper into Ukraine. Clark believes that Putin thought that the aid packages, particularly the one from the United States, wouldn't get through the Senate. Now he faces a situation where Ukraine has a renewed flow of supplies that will increase troop morale and could lead to Russia's soldiers facing a much harder fight than they faced for the last year. Does that mean Putin will be forced to leave Ukraine? Not necessarily. But there's another element to this aid package that is huge for the potential outcome of the war and may play the biggest role in destroying Putin's ambitions. It's a sign that the rest of Europe is waking up to the threat that Russia poses. Take the UK as a perfect example. When speaking about the country's most recent $620 million package, Rishi Sunak made it clear that the package represented the UK getting on a war footing for the first time in decades. The aid pledge came with another that would see the UK increase its defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, amounting to around $93 billion over the next 6 years, with Sunak calling it the biggest strengthening of our national defense for a generation. He went on to point out that the world is the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, while warning against taking a complacent approach that would see Russia take Ukraine and potentially turn its attention to other European countries. The country also intends to invest around $12 billion into ammunition production, likely as a result of having seen Russia's tactics in Ukraine. There are signs of the British war machine starting to activate elsewhere. Beyond sending aid to Ukraine, the UK has also announced that it intends to deploy some of its Typhoon fighter jets to Poland, giving Poland more options when it comes to policing its skies. It's not outside the realms of possibility that those jets will be there to keep an eye on what Russia does should it take Ukraine. After all, as AP News points out, Poland has already seen Russian incursions into its airspace since the war in Ukraine began. Even more worrying for Putin is that it's not just the UK that's on notice. The rest of Europe is quickly figuring out that the Russian war machine might target them next. Before the UK and the US announced their aid bills, the EU had agreed to send $53 billion in financial support between 2024 and 27. Rather than being dedicated to funding military equipment, the EU said the money could be used to keep the country's administration running. More bad news for Putin, as well as paying for salaries, pensions, and public services. So there's funding coming from two fronts, military and civilian aid, that could strengthen Ukraine in its fight against Russia. America's substantial aid package also places pressure on many European countries to follow suit with packages of their own. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have contributed massive amounts already, with the latter having committed 1.5% of its GDP to Ukraine, with Estonia and Lithuania committing 1.8%. Germany is delivering a Patriot system to Ukraine, as mentioned earlier, with the country already having established itself as the biggest supplier of military aid to Ukraine behind the United States. And of course, we have France's President Macron talking about the possibility of sending NATO troops into Ukraine to fight Russia is still on the table, even if the rest of NATO's leaders claim that's an impossibility. These are far from the only examples, but all prove that Europe is increasingly concerned about Putin's ambitions, both for Ukraine itself and for the rest of the continent, should he succeed in taking Ukraine. Again, that's not what Putin wanted. His invasion of Ukraine was meant to be a smash and grab. The country was supposed to roll over in a matter of months, accept that it would become part of Russia, and the rest of Europe would just have to deal with it. Instead, Ukraine has held on. It's now being buoyed by financial aid that will allow it to fight for another year, and Putin is having to watch as the rest of Europe mobilizes production, while committing even more money to Ukraine, so it'll be ready to fight if Putin turns his attentions beyond Ukraine. It all adds up to Russia potentially losing steam in Ukraine. Putin has already responded by threatening to increase the rate of missile strikes in Ukraine in response to America's aid bill passing. Through his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, Putin said that Russia will increasingly target storage bases and logistics centers for Western weapons in response. Russian propaganda has also started the nuclear weapons conversation again, with Newsweek reporting on April 29th that state TV channel Russia 1 news anchor Dmitry Kiselyov has talked about Russian nuclear launches on the air. He said that if NATO troops enter Ukraine, Russian nukes would not only disarm France in an instant, a clear shot at Macron, but would target American decision-making centers. Those words may not come directly from Putin, but they come from a prominent figure on Russian state-sponsored television, meaning we can assume Putin approves. And as Clark concludes in his interview with Times Radio, the renewed threats of nuclear war could be a sign that Russia is worried. It knows Ukraine is going to get a heavy injection of military equipment, and that injection may just be a heavy enough dose to stop the Russian war machine in its tracks. But what do you think? Could the announcement of financial aid from the UK and the US help Ukraine to turn the tide in the war? Is it all a case of too little too late? And is Putin genuinely worried about the rest of Europe mobilizing in the wake of his invasion? Are his plans going to come crumbling down? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. On April 13, 2024, Iran launched a barrage of attacks against Israel, sending over 300 drones and cruise and ballistic missiles its way. Yet not a single drone or cruise missile managed to enter Israeli airspace. For the most part, Israel has its multi-layered air defense system to thank for this extraordinary success rate. Still, the country wouldn't have been able to pull off this remarkable achievement without a hastily assembled coalition, including the US and the UK, which helped shoot down Iranian drones over Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. The speed and effectiveness at which allies came together to protect Israel brought one question to the forefront: why can't the same level of coordination and support be extended to Ukraine? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was the first to pose the question, shortly followed by the German parliament, the famous Bundestag. In a rare feat, both the leading and opposing parties in the Bundestag were in favor of deploying the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukrainian airspace. But how would this protection work? Would Germany be the only country to commit resources? And why does Ukraine need so much help in the first place? These are just some of the questions we'll answer as this video progresses. But first, let's see how this important idea started brewing in Germany. The German parliament members, MPs, were actually the first to put this idea forward. It initially came from German military experts like Nico Lange, a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference, and Lieutenant General Heinrich Braus, a former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning. However, it's the Bundestag that has the power to turn this idea into reality, so it shouldn't be surprising that the proposal only gained significant traction when taken up by German parliament members. As mentioned, and as reported by Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a German media outlet, both the members of the ruling liberal-left coalition, the Greens and the Free Democratic Party, as well as the members of the opposing Christian Democratic Union, supported the idea of deploying NATO air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace. Here's what MPs from these parties had to say on the matter. Markus Faber of the Free Democratic Party discussed the feasibility of Ukrainian protection plans in the long run. He pointed out that there's currently a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So according to Faber, step one would be securing a sufficient number of these systems. Only then should the Western allies fully commit to protecting the Ukrainian skies. Roderich Kiesewetter of the Christian Democratic Union explained what kind of effect this commitment would have on Ukraine. According to him, shooting down Russian drones over Ukraine would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. And given how forcefully Russia has been attacking that front in recent times, Ukraine can't afford to miss any opportunity to strengthen its defenses. But how would this strengthening even work? Agnieszka Brugger, the deputy chair of the Greens, explained which part of the Ukrainian airspace could be protected by NATO, as well as which countries should be part of this endeavor. In her words, the air defense systems should be deployed on the borders of countries that border Ukraine, so that they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, the chairman of the German Committee on European Affairs and a member of the same party, further specified which countries could be expected to help protect Ukraine in the long run. According to Hofreiter, Ukrainian airspace could be protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania. The plan is to establish a safe zone extending some 43 miles into the Ukrainian territory and protect this zone using the NATO Integrated Air Defense System units stationed in these two countries. The NATO Integrated Air and Missile Defense System, NATINAMS for short, is a command and control network that combines the radar, missile systems, and aircraft of NATO member countries to ensure comprehensive air defense coverage and coordination. The Center Allied Air Command of all NATO member countries in Europe is based at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which coordinates centers spread all over the continent. Both Romania and Poland house an air operations center, the former in Balotesti and the latter in Poland, Warsaw-Prai. Both countries also have a rather developed complex of radar stations, which makes them ideal candidates for helping to protect Ukrainian airspace. As far as their equipment goes, the Polish Air Force boasts the Backbone system, comprised of 3 NUR-12M and 3 RAT-31DL long-range radars, while the Romanian Air Force possesses 5 ANFPS-117 air search radars distributed across 5 radar stations. But as you probably know, radars alone aren't enough to ensure effective air defense. That's why additional air defense systems would have to be set up on the territory of these two countries. For now, we can only speculate on what these systems might be based on the model used for this proposal, the Iranian attack on Israel. With this in mind, let's look at how this attack unfolded and, more importantly, how it was thwarted. Sometime after midnight on April 13th, the Israeli air raid alerts blasted through the night. Citizens were urged to seek shelter as explosions erupted in the distance. The reason for these alerts lay in the 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles launched by Iran, targeting strategic locations throughout Israel. However, the explosions echoing through the air weren't the sounds of these missiles and drones hitting their target. No, they were the sounds of successful interceptions. Only a handful of the 110 ballistic missiles managed to reach the country, while none of the 170 drones and 30 cruise missiles had the chance. This was made possible by the swift reaction of several countries. The projectiles were fired from Iran's territory, as well as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. They were intercepted and downed by Israel, the US, the UK, and Jordan. Let's start with Israel. As part of the first line of defense, the country sent the F-35 combat fighters to intercept the projectiles. This was possible due to the fact that most of the projectiles were sent from relatively far away. The shortest distance from Iran to Israel is about 620 miles and includes the airspaces of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. With this swift action, Israel was able to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside the country. For any projectile that managed to slip through the first line of defense, Israel used the Aerial Defense Array, a newly installed national air defense system. The system in question has been in place since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, and it consists of 3 layers. Layer number 1, the Arrow missile defense. The highest tier of the Aerial Defense Array was used to physically intercept long-range ballistic missiles, and it did so successfully, primarily relying on the Arrow 3 exo-atmospheric hypersonic anti-ballistic missiles. Layer number 2, the David's Sling. The middle tier of the Aerial Defense Array was employed to take out short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, downing them as far as 186 miles away from Israel. Layer number 3, the Iron Dome system. This system is the reason why none of the 170 drones fired by Iran reached Israeli airspace, let alone any of their targets. Though this system was initially designed to protect cities and strategic sites against unguided rockets, it's recently been upgraded to take out drones as well. A decision that has obviously saved the day in Israel. So that's how Israel alone defended its territory against the incoming threat. But what about the allies? According to US President Joe Biden, the US forces helped Israel take down nearly all drones and missiles launched on that fateful Friday. The US Central Command, CENTCOM, went into more detail. According to CENTCOM, its forces took out over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, some of which, 1 missile and 7 drones, were destroyed before they were even launched from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Others were downed over southern Syria, with air defense systems deployed from undisclosed bases in the region. 2 aircraft and 2 destroyers that the US moved to the region before the Iranian attacks also helped, shooting down 4 to 6 ballistic missiles. But as helpful as these counterattacks were, they weren't the most significant contribution to the Israeli defensive operation. The US intelligence was. The intricate command and control system set up between the US, Israel, and some Arab neighboring countries provided extremely precise intelligence that essentially helped Israel neutralize all the threats coming its way. So the US did its fair share in defending Israel. What about the UK? The UK also rose to the occasion, sending Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets to shoot down a number of Iranian drones. As for Jordan, you might be surprised to see this country among the nations helping down threats coming for Israel, given how critical Jordan was of the Israeli actions against Hamas in Gaza. However, Jordan didn't do it for the sake of protecting Israel, despite having a peace treaty with the country. It did it to protect its citizens, as a number of Iranian missiles and drones entered Jordanian airspace. Remember, Jordan was a part of the shortest route from Iran to Israel. For this endeavor, Jordan relied on its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets, which proved extremely useful, even at night. France was also involved in the conflict, but there's no official information on whether the country downed any drones or missiles. For now, all that's known is that it helped patrol Israeli airspace. Given how comprehensive the response to the Iranian attacks was, it shouldn't be surprising that only 5 ballistic missiles managed to evade air defenses and impact Israeli territory. 4 of them landed in the Air Force base housing the Israeli F-35 fighter jets, the very same jets used to defend Israel against Iran. The only missile that did any damage hit a runway. The others hit hangars which were either empty or out of use. The 5th ballistic missile did manage to reach Israel, but it didn't reach its intended target, a radar site in the north of the country. So there you have it, a masterclass on how a well-coordinated and multi-layered air defense system, supported by international collaboration and advanced technology, can effectively neutralize a significant missile and drone threat. So what's the issue? Why can't the same be done in Ukraine? Well, for starters, Ukraine's air defense system doesn't even come close to the sophistication and integration of Israel's air defense network. This rang true even before the Russian invasion, but the conflict has further exacerbated the challenges. As Zelensky put it, Ukraine lacks the sufficient air defense equipment to protect the country against the Russian terror. However, he also declared that another, more important element was missing for this defense: the world's determination to protect Ukraine and stand up against Russia in the skies. That's the reason Zelensky asked for Allied help to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the first place. As he pointed out, neither Israel nor Ukraine are NATO member countries. So if NATO allies can help protect Israel against missiles and drones, what stops them from doing the same for Ukraine? Unfortunately, the answer is rather simple: a fear of drawing NATO into a war against Russia. Though the Israeli scenario demonstrated that NATO allies can interfere without joining the conflict, it seems that the situation in Ukraine is viewed through a different geopolitical lens. That's why the US and the UK outright refuse to commit any resources to guarding the Ukrainian airspace. As John Kirby, the White House National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator, explained the US's refusal to help Ukraine in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. Though he did add that President Biden always made it clear that the US had no plans to directly engage in the conflict in Ukraine. The country is, however, Ukraine's #1 military aid provider by a margin, which means the US provides Ukraine with the necessary weapons to protect its airspace, and this is no small feat. As for the UK, the country's Foreign Secretary David Cameron was a bit more direct when addressing the UK's refusal to help Ukraine shoot down Russian drones. In an interview with LBC, a UK radio station, he outright said that the reason for the refusal lies in the fear of escalating the conflict into a direct confrontation with Russia. His exact words were, "If you want to avoid an escalation in terms of a wider European war, I think the one thing you need to do is avoid NATO troops directly engaging Russian troops. That will be a danger of escalation." Cameron added that using fighter jets to down drones, as the UK did in Israel, isn't always the best option. Air defense systems are more effective. In other words, Ukraine needs air defense systems and not fighter jets. The UK lacks the former, or at least the systems that would make the biggest change, the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. However, a lack of sufficient air defense systems isn't the only reason why Ukraine is desperately asking Germany and other NATO allies for help. The problem also lies in the proliferation of Russian drones. Russia was somewhat slow to adapt drone technology, but it's now making up for it by growing its fleet at an unprecedented rate. This particularly applies to the so-called kamikaze drones, a kind of aerial weapon designed to loiter around a target until it's located and then attack it by crashing into it. Russia is going all out on these drones. At first, Russia imported them from Iran, opting for the country's Hayser Shahed 136 models. In 2 years, Russia has imported thousands of these drones and fired over 4,600 of them. With a reported weight of about 440 pounds, they fly as fast as 115 miles per hour and have a flying range between 620 and 1,550 miles. Though the Shahed 136 drones were believed to be extremely cheap for unmanned aerial vehicle technology, a leaked correspondence suggests that Russia has been paying between 193,000 and 290,000 per drone. The former figure applies to batches of 6,000 drones, while the latter is for batches of 2,000 drones bought. That's likely why Russia has set up domestic production facilities that allow it to be substantially less dependent on Iranian drones. According to reports, Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones domestically by the summer of 2025. And the more drones that are produced, the more will be launched against Ukrainian targets, depleting the country's anti-drone ammunition. To make matters worse, Russia has also been experimenting with modifying the Shahed 136 to make them even more destructive. Some of these experiments include spraying drones to reduce detection and adding cameras to enhance reconnaissance capabilities. Though these modifications are yet to make any change in the Russian war effort, they serve as a concerning reminder that Russia will stop at nothing to advance its military capabilities and crush Ukrainian resistance. These incessant efforts also include working with Iran on developing new attack drones specifically for the war in Ukraine. The drones, cited as a huge concern for Ukraine, are described as explosive and reconnaissance drones that could potentially seek out high-value targets, including the US and UK multiple launch rocket systems used on the Ukrainian battlefields. The Shahed 107 drones, as they are called, are roughly 8 feet long, can be launched from a vehicle, and have a flying range of up to 930 miles. Another testament to the Russian "the end justifies the means" mentality is the fact that the country has children producing its drones. Yep, you heard that correctly. Activists from the cyber resistance group published a series of documents that prove that the previously mentioned Shahed 136 combat drones are manufactured by underage civilians enrolled in the Alabuga Polytech College in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. In 2024 alone, these unexpected manufacturers are expected to produce 10,000 drone units. To reach this staggering number, over 500 students have been allocated to the drone production project. That's roughly 40% of the total number of students enrolled in 2023, which was 1,209. These students are engaged in various fields of manufacturing, including electric installation, industrial robotics, and numerical control programming. Given Russia's unscrupulous but unyielding efforts in the drone department, it shouldn't be surprising Ukraine needs all the help it can get in the skies. Though to be fair, Ukraine boasts pretty impressive interception rates, given the threat it faces every day. But when it comes to suicide drones, only a 100% interception rate would be considered satisfactory. Why? Because even if a single drone reaches its target, it can unleash devastation and take many lives in the process. Worst of all, the Ukrainian success rate at intercepting drones is gradually decreasing. The first few months of 2024 have been particularly challenging, as Ukraine has stretched its air defense units to their limits, facing an onslaught of Russian drones hitting cities with deadly accuracy and frequency, and Ukraine has only managed to shoot down about 82% of them. This begs the question, how low will this rate go before the Western allies interfere? As things stand, Ukraine can only defend itself against these deadly attacks with their help. The help in question could come in two forms. Number one, the Allies can supply more air defense systems to Ukraine, prioritizing models designed to intercept drones. Number two, the Allies could get involved more directly. They can support Ukrainian efforts to strike crucial targets like air bases, manufacturing facilities, and drone storage sites within Russia. After all, destroying Russian drones before they're even launched is the most effective way to protect Ukraine from the devastation they cause. The second approach also includes downing the already launched drones, which is what NATO essentially did for Israel. So will Ukraine be as lucky as Israel anytime soon? As things currently stand, the answer is unfortunately no. Well, at least as far as the second, more direct approach goes. You see, the German proposal to use NATO-integrated air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace has been rejected by the ruling party, the Social Democratic Party. Why? For the same reasons the US and UK refuse to help Ukraine. It's simply too dangerous. To quote the head of the Social Democratic Party, Rolf Mützenich, protecting Ukrainian airspace via a NATO deployment would go against the principle of not becoming actively engaged in the war. Mützenich used two simple words to describe what this proposal could be: fire hazard. And the fire in question could consume not just Ukraine, but NATO as well. However, it's highly unlikely German MPs will just give up on the idea. After all, we're talking about a country that has helped Ukraine massively since the beginning of Russian aggression, so much so that it's become the second largest provider of military aid to the country. A great deal of this aid has also been focused on the Ukrainian Air Force specifically. Here's a brief overview of all the air defense systems Germany sent to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion: 9 TRML-4D air surveillance radars, 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 52 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with spare parts, 146,000 rounds of ammunition for the Gepard guns, 4,000 rounds of practice ammunition for self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems, 3 Iris-T SLM and 1 Iris-T SLS air defense system with missiles, and 2 Patriot air defense systems with missiles and spare parts. And that's not all. As of May 2024, Germany plans to further raise these numbers by sending another Patriot air defense system and more Patriot missiles, 2 more Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 9 more Iris-T SLM systems, 11 more Iris-T SLS systems, and additional Iris-T SLM and Iris-T SLS missiles, and 15 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with 249,680 rounds of ammunition. In the drone department, Germany has been equally generous. So far, the country has sent the following equipment: 212 vector reconnaissance drones with spare parts, 215 RQ-35 Hydron reconnaissance drones, 18 Promoco-1 reconnaissance drones, 7 Songbird reconnaissance drones, 70 frequency range extensions for anti-drone devices, 84 anti-drone sensors and jammers, 180 RF-360 drone detection systems, 93 drone sensors, 1 Lunar NG reconnaissance system, 10 anti-drone guns, 12 electronic anti-drone devices, and 20 unmanned surface vessels. Plus, in the coming months, Germany will send an additional 263 vector drones, 34 Hydron drones, 15 anti-drone sensors and jammers, and 50 unmanned surface vessels. Though each of these pieces of equipment is a lifesaver for Ukraine in its fight to protect its skies, none are arguably as important as the Iris and Patriot air defense systems. The Iris systems gifted by Germany have so far demonstrated a 100% kill rate in the Ukrainian war, managing to shoot down all targets, even when facing overwhelming odds. This system has also proven incredibly successful against the notorious Shahed 136 kamikaze drones. One look at the capabilities of the Iris air defense systems, and these success rates will make perfect sense. The Iris missile itself has a range of up to 25 miles and can hit targets flying at an altitude of up to 66,000 feet. The system's radar has a detection range of up to 155 miles, which allows it to track targets with high precision. But the best thing about this system is the agility of the Iris missile. This, paired with an active radar proximity fuse and improved heat-seeking homing, allows the missile to take out fast-moving and small targets like those often seen in Russian attacks on Ukraine. As far as the Patriot air defense system goes, it offers a higher altitude defense against ballistic missiles, aircraft, and drones, sort of like the highest tier of the Israeli aerial defense array. As Ukraine lacks native air defenses, it heavily relies on the Patriot system to safeguard its airspace. According to Zelensky, Ukraine needs about 25 of these systems to successfully do so. However, so far Germany has been the only country that has sent multiple Patriot systems and batteries to Ukraine. Despite Zelensky's pleading with allies to follow in Germany's footsteps, none of the other NATO countries that possess these systems – Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, and Sweden – have committed to sending them. As for the US, the country sent 1 Patriot system in 2022. However, it plans to send more in 2024 as part of a massive aid package. But what makes Germany different from all other allies is, the country hasn't just been sending military aid to Ukraine, it's also been tirelessly pleading with other allies to do so. That's why this current push to use the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukraine seems so promising. As mentioned, Germany has been particularly proactive about Ukrainian air defense. In April 2024, the country launched a new initiative to secure more critically needed air defense systems for Ukraine. As Germany's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, puts it, stronger air defenses are a matter of life and death for thousands of people in Ukraine and the best protection for our own security. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz continued these pleas by urging European allies to look at their stocks and provide whatever air defense systems they can to Ukraine. Of course, he highlighted the importance of the Patriot systems, which are the only systems that can counter all Russian attacks, whether via aircraft, missiles, or drones. Now, European countries are facing a choice: meet NATO's capability targets for their own states or provide more aid to Ukraine. However, even NATO seems to be pushing for the second option, joining Germany's efforts. The alliance's Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, said that sacrificing individual countries' stockpile targets for the sake of aiding Ukraine is the only right choice. For now, it seems that the Netherlands, Czech Republic, and Denmark might be the first to rally behind the proposal. Polish officials have also previously discussed the possibility of aiding Ukraine more directly, but so far no concrete decisions have been made. Though if Germany succeeds in realizing its proposal, Poland will undoubtedly have a major role to play in defending Ukrainian airspace. But what do you think? Do you believe Germany will manage to find a way to protect Ukrainian airspace from drones? And if so, will Russia see this move as a clear message that Ukraine isn't alone, or just as an invitation to start an all-out war? And finally, which countries besides Germany will risk this all-out war to help Ukraine? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Now go and check out how the German military will become Europe's most powerful, or click this other video instead. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the world watched, expecting Kyiv to fall within days under the might of the Russian army. But more than 2 years later, Ukraine has not only survived, but has bested Russia on multiple occasions. How did this happen? The answer lies in military aid from over 50 countries, with one European nation standing out: Germany. Germany, initially hesitant, has become Ukraine's strongest European ally, providing extensive financial aid, military training, advanced weaponry, humanitarian relief, and diplomatic support. Yet even this powerhouse's efforts seemed insufficient, so Germany devised a bold new strategy to help Ukraine indirectly but effectively. What is this secretive plan? How could it create a defensive shield over Ukraine and potentially turn the tide of the war? In this video, we'll unveil Germany's daring strategy to utilize NATO air defense systems, the geopolitical maneuvers behind this plan, and its long-term feasibility. Let's dive into Germany's plan and discover how this unexpected hero is reshaping the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Germany wants to utilize NATO air defense systems to shoot down Russian drones over the west of Ukraine, effectively creating a semblance of a no-fly zone in the area. Given how much Russian drones have decimated Ukrainian forces and civilian areas, this defensive shield should help turn the tides in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. But what would this defensive shield look like exactly? Well, it would cover some 43 miles of the Ukrainian territory, which would now become a safe zone under NATO's protection. The protection in question would come from the alliance's integrated air defense system units stationed in the neighboring countries of Poland and Romania. Of course, the primary reason for the involvement of these two countries is purely geographical. They're located to the west of Ukraine, precisely where the safe zone is to be established. The defense systems themselves would be placed as close to the Ukrainian border as possible. As Agnieszka Brugger, a member of the German Bundestag and the deputy chairwoman of the Alliance 90 in the Greens parliamentary group, puts it, it would be best to deploy air defense systems on the borders of countries that border Ukraine, so they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, a fellow member of the Bundestag and the Alliance 90 in the Greens, was the one to specify that the said bordering countries should be Poland and Romania. His exact words were that the possibility of Ukrainian airspace being protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania should not be ruled out in the long run. The long run part is especially important, given that Germany is yet to receive a green flag to enter Ukraine in this way. More on that later. For now, let's discuss how the idea of entering the Ukrainian airspace even came to be. It begins with the April 13, 2024 attack on Israel by Iran, which fired more than 300 missiles and armed drones at Israel. Despite that barrage, Israel managed to deflect much of the attack thanks to a multi-layered air defense system, which consisted of 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles. But that defense system itself isn't the primary reason Germany has contemplated installing an air defense system inside Ukraine. It was the response of Israel's allies that inspired German decision-makers to propose entering Ukrainian airspace. Israel's first layer of defense was the F-35 combat fighters. You're probably well familiar with this jet. After all, we're talking about arguably the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Originally, the F-35 Lightning II stealth fighter jets were produced by Lockheed Martin. They soon caught the attention of Israel, thanks to their advanced stealth and information processing capabilities, as well as an impressive supersonic speed of Mach 1.6. That's not to mention that these jets can carry up to 18,000 pounds of internal and external ordnance in what Lockheed Martin CEO Marilyn A. Hewson referred to as beast mode. So unsurprisingly, Israel became the first country after the US to acquire the F-35 jets, 50 of them to be precise. However, the country has since made significant changes to the model, manufacturing its own wings and electronic warfare system. The subsequent Israeli F-35 variant was named Adir, meaning the mighty one in Hebrew. The jet's might was on full display in April 2024 when these technological marvels were sent to intercept projectiles launched from the territories of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The F-35s reportedly managed to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside Israeli airspace. Now, sending fighter jets to intercept missiles isn't always possible. This decision is made based on speed, altitude, and trajectory of the incoming threat, as well as the capabilities of the available air defense systems. But since the projectiles coming at Israel were sent from relatively far away, there was time for the F-35s to take flight. Interestingly, some of the Iranian projectiles were seemingly targeting the Nevatim airbase, which houses the Israeli F-35 variants in the first place. This just goes to show the strategic value Israel and Iran places on its F-35 fleet and the effectiveness of these advanced fighters in countering threats. But mighty as they are, the F-35s couldn't possibly counter all the projectiles sent Israel's way. That's where Israel's long-standing multi-layered defense system took over. Layer number 1, the upper layer, consists of Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 ballistic missile defense systems. The goal of this layer is to intercept medium to long-range missiles. Layer number 2, the middle layer, is the so-called David's Sling. This innovative defense solution tackles short to medium-range ballistic missiles and larger caliber rockets. It's designed to strike the targets directly, shooting them down from as far as 186 miles away from Israel. And layer number 3, the bottom layer, is the famed Iron Dome. This mobile system defends Israel against short-range surface-to-surface rockets and unmanned aerial vehicles, aka drones. Iron Dome is the first missile defense system of its kind, and it's highly capable of handling multiple incoming threats at once, which it successfully proved in April. This system is a primary reason none of the 170 drones sent by Iran hit their targets. But as mentioned, the Israeli air defense capabilities weren't the only reason it was able to thwart the Iranian attack. The US, UK, Jordan, and France also came to Israel's rescue. The US downed over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, according to the US Central Command, or CENTCOM. Even more impressively, some of these projectiles were destroyed before even taking flight from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. The rest were intercepted over southern Syria. The US also provided vital intelligence that armed Israel with the necessary knowledge to take out all the threats coming its way. As for the UK, the country's Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets downed an undisclosed number of Iranian drones. The same goes for Jordan, undoubtedly the most surprising ally to Israel. The country used its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets to fend off the Iranian attack. Though to be fair, the reason Jordan got involved appears to be more self-serving. The Iranian projectiles had to enter Jordanian airspace to get to Israel, so essentially Jordan was defending its country and citizens, not Israel. According to Brian Kachulis, a senior fellow of US foreign policy at the Middle East Institute, this move sent a clear message that Jordan and Israel have this shared interest in making sure that the airspace in their territory is defended. This leaves us with France, which did take part in Israel's defense, but primarily contributed by patrolling the country's airspace. As a result of this joint action, only a handful of the initially launched projectiles managed to reach Israeli territory, and it was only the ballistic missiles which managed to inflict minor damage near a runway at the Nevatim airbase and to a road nearby. Though the plan was to paralyze the base and thus damage Israel's air capabilities, Iran failed miserably, as the Nevatim base remained operational after and even throughout the attack. That cooperative system is what inspired German military experts Nico Lange and Lieutenant General Heinrich Braus to put forward the idea of establishing air defense in bordering countries and in Ukraine. Seeing what can happen when allies come together to defend an impacted airspace, the German parliament members, or MPs, brought Lange and Braus's notion of Germany and NATO doing the same for Ukraine. Perhaps surprisingly, even the opposing political forces, the Greens, the Free Democratic Party, and the Christian Democratic Union, agreed that this was a good idea. Roderich Kiesewetter of the Christian Democratic Union pointed out that this joint action would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. He also mentioned the April attack on Israel as an example, emphasizing that the allies involved in Israel's defense didn't automatically become parties to the conflict. Unfortunately, this argument, as well as the unexpected unity in the Bundestag, wasn't enough to sway the German government to take direct military action in support of Ukraine. This means that Germany isn't allowed to enter the Ukrainian airspace, at least for now. The mere fact that this proposition was even discussed by the Bundestag and attracted so much attention suggests that Germany is reconsidering its role in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict and pushing the boundaries of its commitment to collective defense. If you remember, Bundestag member Anton Hofreiter, who we mentioned earlier, saw this plan being carried out in the long run, so Germany's role in the conflict is likely to continue to evolve. But why hasn't Germany already taken this decisive action to enter the Ukrainian airspace? Well, there are multiple hurdles standing in the way of this historic action. We've already briefly brushed on the first and arguably the most important one. Germany is simply scared that entering Ukraine, even indirectly, would trigger an all-out war with Russia. And let's be honest, a direct conflict with Russia is the last thing Germany would want, especially when both world wars Germany had previously fought against Russia ended disastrously for Germany. And Germany isn't the only one with concerns about escalations. Fear of a greater conflict is also the reason why the US and the UK refused to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the same way they defended the Israeli airspace. The UK's Foreign Secretary David Cameron put it bluntly, saying that deploying NATO forces even indirectly might lead to escalation in terms of a wider European war. Never one to fear an adversary, the US explained its refusal to get involved in a slightly different way. When asked about protecting the Ukrainian airspace with the US defense systems, the White House National Security Council's Strategic Communications Coordinator, John Kirby, pointed out the difference between the Ukrainian and Israeli scenarios. He summed up his difference in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. And to be fair, Kirby's right. Protecting Ukraine would be significantly more challenging than defending Israel from a purely military perspective. Ukraine shares a longer border with Russia, and the conflict zone is vast, with multiple fronts and shifting battle lines. This makes it difficult to establish a clear and secure airspace over Ukraine, especially given Russia's air defense systems and military capabilities. But let's say Germany and other Ukrainian allies move past this fear and commit to protecting Ukrainian airspace at all costs. Is this protection even feasible in the long run? As things currently stand, the answer is a resounding no. Remember, the Iranian attack on Israel was an isolated incident, while protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be an ongoing and complex operation, one that the European allies simply don't have enough air defense systems to sustain. As Markus Faber of Germany's Free Democratic Party pointed out, there are a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So for Germany to even think about defending Ukraine's airspace against Russia, it would first have to secure more defense systems. Only under those circumstances would it be possible to deploy Western air defense systems to protect the sky over Ukraine. And let's face it, Ukraine is no Israel. The country doesn't have the groundbreaking Iron Dome or state-of-the-art F-35s. The country waited for what it seems like forever to even get its hands on the few dozen F-16s it does now have. Throw the damage inflicted by Russia in the months of conflict into the mix, and you'll understand why protecting the Ukrainian airspace would be simply overwhelming. It becomes even more worrisome when you consider that Russian drones seem to keep coming. The country is going all in on so-called kamikaze drones designed to carry explosives, loiter around the target for quite some time, and then crash into it. At first, Russia imported these drones from Iran, opting for the Hesse Shahed 136 models. Since the beginning of the invasion, Russia has reportedly fired over 4,500 of these destructive drones at Ukrainian targets. But it gets worse. Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones at domestic production facilities by the summer of 2025, which doesn't bode well for Ukraine's already weakened air defense. Of course, Ukraine isn't standing idly by. The country's own drones are getting smarter in an effort to dodge Russia's jamming signals. This allows Ukraine to carry out more effective defensive measures while underscoring the country's continual efforts to adapt to the evolving threat posed by Russia. But how long can Ukraine go on its own? Certainly not for too long. The country's drone interception rates are already decreasing drastically, mostly due to the sheer volume of drones being deployed by Russia. Will this be enough to prompt Germany to go through with entering Ukraine? For now it seems plausible, but it's still not close to fruition. Russia has already accused Germany of entering the Ukraine war, so the country might just as well get directly involved. The accusation came in March 2024, in the aftermath of a leaked conversation between top German officials. Believe it or not, these officials discussed war plans on an unsecured phone line, thus breaking the fundamental protocols of secure communication. Unsurprisingly, Russia managed to intercept this call. The call was then recorded and leaked via Russia Today, the country's state-controlled media outlet. During the call, the German officials discussed the possibility of sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine and the potential impact of this move on the war. A potential target of these missiles would be the highly protected Crimean Bridge connecting Russia to Crimea. As a response to the leaked conversation, Russia summoned German Ambassador Alexander Graf Lambsdorff and registered an official protest. The country saw this conversation as proof that Germany was indeed trying to enter the war in Ukraine, questioning whether German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had lost control over his country and parliament. Russia's response also clearly defined their red lines when it comes to Germany's involvement in Ukraine. Even sending the Taurus missiles would mean Germany is entering the war, which would likely prompt Russia to respond accordingly. But what is it about these Taurus missiles that makes them such a threat to Russia? It's simple, really. The Taurus missiles, jointly developed by Germany and Sweden, are considered one of the most advanced weapon systems in use today. This missile is about 16.5 feet long, weighs 1.4 tons, and can be fired from the air via fighter jets. When fired, it travels at speeds of up to 727 miles per hour, almost the speed of sound, and locates targets that are as far as 300 miles away. Plus, this long-range missile flies at low altitude, only about 114 feet, which makes it nearly impossible to detect with radars. Germany uses Taurus missiles to tackle high-value targets, such as enemy command posts and bunkers. Taurus missiles can penetrate several reinforced concrete walls before the actual warhead explodes, which makes bunkers susceptible to their power. Currently, Germany has around 600 Taurus missiles, 150 of which are ready for deployment. But as things stand, Ukraine won't see a single one of these valuable missiles. Even before the leaked call, Scholz was adamant about not sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and he stood firm on this stance time and again. Why? Because of a deep-seated fear of Russia, according to many experts. Though he describes his stance as prudence and not weakness, it's abundantly clear that he believes that supplying Ukraine with this weapon would provoke Putin to such a degree that he would likely retaliate against Germany. So if you're keeping score, that's two things Germany can't do to directly help Ukraine. It can't enter its airspace or send game-changing missiles. And of course, it also can't enter Ukraine in the conventional way, by sending troops. But this isn't surprising. Since the very beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies reiterated that no troops would be sent to Ukraine. After all, the country isn't a NATO member, which severely limits the alliance's formal obligations to provide military support. The idea of sending troops to Ukraine became a point of controversy due to a statement made by French President Emmanuel Macron in February 2024. Macron stated, "There is no consensus today to send ground troops officially, but nothing is ruled out." He then added, "We will do whatever it takes to ensure that Russia cannot win this war." Of course, these statements sent shockwaves across Europe. Macron didn't seem too fazed, as he reaffirmed this possibility in May 2024. His exact words were, "I'm not ruling anything out, because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out." But unlike Macron, Scholz did rule out this possibility, loud and clear. Scholz said there will be no ground troops, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil who are sent there by European states or NATO states. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg shared the same sentiment, emphasizing that there are no plans for NATO combat troops on the ground in Ukraine. This raises the total to 3 things Germany can't do for Ukraine. But just because Germany can't enter Ukraine just yet doesn't mean it's leaving the country to fend for itself. If you remember, we mentioned that Germany is Ukraine's single largest donor in Europe. So rather than dwelling on all the things Germany can't do, let's review what the country can do, and has done so far. Number 1. Provide military aid. Germany might not be able or willing to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but this in no way lessens the sheer amount of military aid the country has sent so far. If we're talking numbers, Germany has spent approximately $1.7 billion on military assistance to Ukraine in 2022 and $5.3 billion in 2023. So far in 2024, Germany announced plans to ramp up military aid for Ukraine by another $4.1 billion. And this comes after the Bundestag approved a staggering $8.2 billion in military assistance for Kyiv in 2024. But how is this money being spent? Germany's financial commitment to Ukraine is channeled into various crucial areas that significantly enhance Ukraine's defensive capabilities. This includes some $300 million spent on training over 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers in Germany. It also covers the advanced weaponry and equipment Germany sent to Ukraine. The money either accounts for the replacement of weapons sent from the stockpiles of the Bundeswehr, Germany's armed forces, or the country's defense industry deliverables. Though Germany's military aid for Ukraine covers virtually all combat areas, assistance in the air defense department probably interests you the most, given the topic of the video. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, Germany has sent a range of sophisticated air defense systems to Ukraine, significantly enhancing the country's ability to protect its skies. This includes 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, and 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems. But there are 2 air defense systems that made the biggest difference: the Iris and Patriot defense systems. So far, Germany has sent 4 Iris-T SLM and 2 Iris-T SLS air defense systems to Ukraine, together with their corresponding missiles. The SLM variant tackles short-range missiles up to 7.5 miles of range and 5 miles of altitude. The SLS variant deals with medium-range missiles, having a maximum range of roughly 25 miles and a maximum altitude of 12.4 miles. So far, these systems have reportedly had a 100% success kill rate in Ukraine, even when faced with the notorious kamikaze drones. As for the Patriot air defense system, Germany has sent 2 of these systems to Ukraine so far, with the corresponding missiles included. Compared to the Iris system, the Patriot air defense offers a broader range of capabilities and enhanced performance. It's designed to counter high-speed, high-altitude threats such as ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as advanced aircraft. From this description alone, it's easy to understand why Ukraine relies on these air defense systems so immensely, especially given how lackluster the country's native systems are. But 2 Patriot systems aren't nearly enough. According to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, the country needs at least 25 to successfully defend its territory. Germany only plans to give 1 more system in the future, but at least it's going all out on missiles, announcing a shipment of 100 Patriot air defense missiles in June 2024. Number 2, the use of German weapons against targets in Russia. This might be the closest Germany will come to directly entering the Russo-Ukrainian conflict so far. In May 2024, the country authorized Ukraine to hit some targets on Russian soil using the weapons Germany is supplying. This authorization came right after the US did the same, which was seen as a groundbreaking policy change. Ukraine was allowed to use these weapons to defend the border region of Kharkiv, 12 miles from Russia, which has been mercilessly attacked by Russian forces throughout May. With 2 of the most direct military involvement measures out of the way, let's quickly list other ways in which Germany has helped Ukraine since 2022. Number 3, it's imposed massive and unprecedented sanctions on Russia, hoping to financially dismantle the country's almighty war machine. Number 4, Germany has sent massive amounts of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, ensuring that medical care, food, and clean water reach the Ukrainian people quickly. Number 5, Germany has provided direct financial aid to Ukraine to allow the country to stabilize its financial systems amidst the ongoing conflict. Number 6, German high-ranking officials have tirelessly pleaded with other allies to send more aid to Ukraine, placing special emphasis on air defense. Though these pleas have seemingly failed to secure the crucial air defense systems, many countries have been making smaller pledges in response to Germany's efforts. According to the German Ministry of Defense, the following countries have promised to send additional aid as a direct response to the country's efforts: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Lithuania, Norway, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, the UK, and the US. Number 7, Germany has vowed to help rebuild Ukraine and is already planning national and international short-term and long-term support. Number 8, Germany has been actively helping refugees from Ukraine, supporting them financially and protecting them socially. And number 9, Germany has supported the efforts of the International Criminal Court to document the war crimes Russia committed in Ukraine, both financially and by directly collecting evidence. This extensive list leaves us with a single question: from where does Germany's tremendous willingness to help Ukraine come? Some experts see this support as a result of Germany's commitment to international law and human rights, as well as basic sympathy for the Ukrainian people. However, the more pragmatic analysts point to a combination of strategic, economic, and political factors that drive Germany's extensive support for Ukraine. Chief among them is the fear that if Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe will follow suit. As German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock put it, ultimately it's about one thing: supporting Ukraine keeps the war away from us. Of course, there are also those who claim that Germany simply can't seem to shake its World War II guilt, which fuels its foreign policy decisions and a remarkable commitment to peace and stability. But what camp are you in? Why do you believe Germany is helping Ukraine so extensively? And do you see the country entering Ukraine, directly or indirectly, anytime soon? Share your opinions in the comments section below. Now go and check out Germany Wants to Get Involved in the Ukraine War, or click this other video instead. Vladimir Putin's ambition to intimidate NATO with his Ukrainian invasion has spectacularly backfired. Far from sowing division and halting expansion, his actions have galvanized the alliance, boosting defense budgets across the board and ushering Finland and Sweden into the fold. How's that for unintended consequences? Previously, we explored Finland's contributions to NATO. Now it's time to delve into Sweden's dramatic journey into the alliance. Why is Sweden's NATO membership a strategic nightmare for Putin's grand designs? For one, Sweden is seriously considering developing a sixth-generation fighter jet, and despite its historically low level of military spending, its army is highly advanced. But this is all just the tip of the iceberg. Stick around as we dive into all of the reasons Sweden terrifies Putin. Let's begin. Sweden formally applied for NATO membership alongside Finland in May 2022 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For both countries, it was the end of a long tradition of military non-alignment. At the time, Vladimir Putin dismissed the new developments, saying that the two countries joining the alliance would not constitute a threat in itself. Rather, he said that he would only consider it a threat if they deployed a new military infrastructure in their territories. The latter came with a backhanded warning of a response in kind. Privately, though, Putin understood how deep of a blow this is to Russian power in Europe, and he must have been hoping that internal controversy would prevent them from joining. To admit a new member to the alliance, all NATO countries must be in agreement. Turkey stalled entry for Finland and Sweden, claiming that the two countries harbored members of Kurdish groups that it recognizes as terrorist organizations. Finland and Sweden's prohibition on arms exports to Turkey in response to its military operations in Syria in 2019 was also an item of complaint for the Turks. In the Turks' resistance, Vladimir Putin had a hope. Turkey is a purchaser of Russia's S-400 air defense system, which has earned it the ire of the United States. Turkey has also proven a vital lifeline for Russian energy exports and is now Moscow's fourth largest customer. Turkey has also gone through a period of democratic backsliding under Erdogan, who has been in power there in one form or another since 2003. Might the Turks prevent the two new countries from joining after all? Finland proved better able to overcome the Turks' objections, and it joined the alliance on April 4, 2023. Sweden, however, still saw its membership stalled, with Ankara claiming that Stockholm was being more intransigent about its concerns than Helsinki had been. At a summit in Madrid in July 2022, Sweden and Turkey agreed on renewed counter-terrorism cooperation both in and outside of NATO's framework. Additionally, NATO would establish a new office, the Special Coordinator for Counter-Terrorism. However, Turkey claimed that Sweden was dragging its feet on these commitments, particularly as the latter's courts blocked extraditions of individuals that it considered terrorists. Protests in Stockholm, where copies of the Quran were burned and Turkish President Erdogan was hanged in effigy, caused further diplomatic tension. Turkey said that this amounted to a hate crime, while the Swedes said it was an item of free expression. Then there was another obstacle. Hungary also objected to Sweden's NATO membership. Budapest's objections were not specific like Ankara's had been, but Stockholm's accusations about the supposed erosion of the rule of law under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was an item of dispute. The Hungarians denied this and claimed that Sweden's accusations made it a less than trustworthy partner. After complicated diplomatic maneuvering, where Sweden changed some of its domestic laws and relaxed rules over its arms sales to Turkey, the Turkish parliament finally voted to permit Sweden to join NATO in January 2024. Then on February 26th, the Hungarian parliament followed suit. The two countries signed an arms deal as part of this agreement. The agreement included Budapest's purchase of 4 Gripen fighter jets and expanded pre-existing logistics contracts. Vladimir Putin's last hopes had run out. Sweden's entry into the alliance became official when it submitted its instrument of accession to the United States government, which is NATO's depository as outlined in the North Atlantic Treaty. This occurred on March 7, 2024. Although NATO has frequently been criticized for adding members of questionable utility and exposing its members to security commitments that might undermine the collective defense principle enshrined in Article 5, Sweden is not such a case, and it adds a lot to the alliance. First, Sweden's entry into the alliance brings renewed geostrategic vulnerabilities for Putin. The fall of the Soviet Union severely constrained Russia's ability to influence the Baltic. Its current projections into the sea come only with the small enclaves around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. Post-Soviet Russia's only choice in the face of this new reality was to heavily fortify Kaliningrad and use it as the center of an anti-access area denial strategy through a buildup of aircraft, anti-ship missiles, and anti-aircraft missiles. Through these, Russia hoped to undermine NATO movements in the Baltic and threaten the commerce of its member states. In effect, Russia attempted to do to the Baltic what China has attempted to do to the South China Sea through its island-building campaign. Sweden's entry into NATO is a grave threat to this post-Soviet strategy. It has the largest coastline of any Baltic nation, allowing for free access to and from the North Sea, making it a maritime transit hub that's much more difficult for Russia to disrupt. Sweden's island of Gotland in particular is a strategic area. It's a key pivot point in the Baltic and only 250 kilometers north of Kaliningrad. This is the perfect area for a forward military base, one that can threaten Kaliningrad and carefully observe Russian activity in the area. It's impossible for Russia to send troops and supplies between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad without transiting close to Gotland. In anticipation of its importance, Sweden is remilitarizing the island as part of its entry into NATO. It's only a matter of time before Stockholm equips it with A2AD assets of its own. Therefore, in any conflict, Kaliningrad will be surrounded and extremely difficult for Russia to reinforce and resupply. Additionally, Sweden's accession to NATO opens up alternative ways to reinforce the vulnerable Baltic states. The Suwalki Gap, the short border between Poland and Lithuania, which is sandwiched between Kaliningrad and Russia's vassal state of Belarus, has long been considered NATO's biggest geostrategic weakness. A pincer movement of Russian forces between these two lines could cut the Baltic states off from their NATO allies by land, while Russia overwhelms them with great numerical superiority over a short front. But with Sweden in the alliance, the Baltic states can now be reinforced through a direct sea route that Russia is in a poor position to dispute. Sweden joining the alliance makes the Baltic, for all practical purposes, a NATO lake. Russia is now surrounded by hostile coastlines in the Baltic Sea, making it practically impossible for it to transit its ships through the area. In any confrontation, NATO is in position to take control of the sea and cut off Russian trade while reinforcing hotspots as needed. Sweden not only brings geographical advantages at sea, but also on land. Its accession to NATO and the reunification of 2 centuries of military non-alignment also opens an unbroken land corridor between Norway and Finland. If either country were to be attacked along its respective borders with Russia, Sweden can act as a supply and troop transit hub for the other. Sweden's accession to NATO also comes with military advantages. Though often lampooned as being somehow effeminate and lacking vigor in its military affairs, Sweden is better prepared for conflict than many of its European neighbors. Although it does not currently meet its NATO benchmark of 2% of GDP on defense, spending only 1.3% in 2022, that number has steadily increased from a low of 1% in 2018. Stockholm plans to continue with this trend and accelerate it. In 2022, Sweden claimed that it aimed to reach the 2% mark by 2026. In September 2023, Sweden doubled down on this, with its defense ministry saying that it would already meet NATO's definition of the 2% mark in 2024, since the alliance's definition is broader and includes more items than appropriations. Nevertheless, on an official defense ministry document, Stockholm insisted it would not be stopping there. The government intends to continue proposing additional resources in the coming years so that the military defense appropriations will equate to 2% of GDP. Sweden also has an advanced military, despite its historically low level of spending. Among its useful assets is a fleet of 122 Stridsvagn tanks, an upgraded variant of the German Leopard 2. Sweden agreed to send 10 of its Stridsvagn tanks to Ukraine in February 2023. According to the Oryx blog, Ukraine has since lost 6 of these, but they demonstrated their worth in an incident from October, where a Russian anti-tank missile destroyed one of the Swedish tanks. However, the crew survived. Sweden thus brings additional tanks to NATO's land forces, ones which protect the lives of valuable tank crews from common anti-armor weapons. Aside from its tanks, Sweden has about 8,000 other vehicles and 26 self-propelled artillery systems, but it's lacking in MLRS systems and towed artillery, as it has none of them, according to the Global Firepower Index. Entry into NATO and an increase in its military budget should reduce this deficiency. In the skies, the Swedes command a fleet of about 30 Saab JAS-39 Gripen aircraft. These fourth-generation jet fighters come packed with the Beyond Visual Range Meteor air-to-air missile, which entered service in 2016. These projectiles have a range of about 150 kilometers with a no-escape zone of 60 kilometers. The no-escape zone is the area where there is a high probability of a kill even when the target is notified of the incoming threat. The Meteor's 60-kilometer range for this is the largest among the world's air-to-air missiles. The missile is, according to Saab, highly resistant to active and passive countermeasures like chaff, flares, and electronic warfare. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Ukraine has asked Sweden for Gripen fighter jets, and in August 2023 claimed that Ukrainian pilots were already training on them. In December, Ukraine and Sweden officially began dialogue on whether to donate some of the latter's Gripens to the Ukrainian Air Force. Sweden's entry into the alliance also offers the potential for its air force to get even stronger. Finland, for example, began its F-35 program in December 2021, when Helsinki selected the Lightning II to replace the FA-18 Hornets in its arsenal. Finland ordered 64 F-35 planes in a deal worth about $9.4 billion. As early as 2014, Sweden signed an agreement to train together with Finland and allow NATO assistance in a crisis. Now that both countries are part of NATO, it's possible and even likely that Sweden will get its own F-35 fleet in the near future, especially since more foreign countries are already opting for it over Sweden's capable Gripen in international arms deals. Sweden has also expressed interest in being part of the multinational effort to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet. It was once part of the Global Air Combat Program alongside the United Kingdom, Italy, and Japan, although it officially withdrew from the effort in November 2023. It remains to be seen if Sweden enters another effort to produce a sixth-generation fighter. That same month, Stockholm announced it would hold off on procuring a future fighter until 2031, after which it would assess risks and possibilities. What we do know is that Sweden is starting to think about a fighter to succeed the Gripen so that it can strengthen its air force against future threats. Either way, it will only get stronger over time thanks to the renewed commitments to its domestic defense and its seriousness about its role in NATO. But Sweden's most powerful addition to NATO's arsenal is not on land or in the skies, but on the seas. If Finland's entry provided an almost fatal check to Russian power on land, Sweden does the same on, and even maybe more importantly, under the seas. Although Sweden only has 5 submarines, 3 of them are of the advanced Gotland class. These submarines are powered by a novel method, the Stirling Air Independent Propulsion (AIP) system. Unlike most conventional submarines, the Gotland class uses liquid oxygen stored in onboard tanks to run diesel engines when the vessel's batteries need to be recharged. This means that they do not need to surface as part of this procedure, as a traditional diesel-electric sub must do. The AIP method not only comes with greater stealth, it also allows for deployment periods normally only seen with nuclear submarines, and indeed, consensus is that the Gotland-class submarine is the most advanced non-nuclear type ever built. Such long deployments are valuable assets for NATO, even in a defensive role. The Baltic is a narrow area with several natural choke points. Stationing Sweden's Gotland-class submarines in these choke points will enable their crews to listen in on and detect Russian submarines and other naval operations, increasing NATO's intelligence gathering capacity and its ability to defend vital infrastructure like gas pipelines and underwater communication cables, which Russian submarine crews are trained to find and disrupt or tap into. Sweden's submarines will also be able to stay there for weeks at a time, remaining on constant alert. Ironically, submarine operations in the Baltic have been a traditional weakness in NATO because with an average depth of only 60 meters, it's too shallow for nuclear-powered subs to operate in. And because the United States Navy's underwater vessels are all nuclear-powered, they have not been able to contribute to the security of the Baltic. The importance of this security is often overlooked, as the Baltic is one of the world's busiest shipping areas, accounting for roughly 15% of the world's maritime trade. Sweden's entry into NATO mitigates this security deficiency. The Baltic also has varying salinity levels due to the large amounts of rivers that feed it. This variation changes the buoyancy of a submarine and the amount of noise it makes. One must know these waters to stay silent. And because Sweden has been operating submarines in the Baltic since 1904, longer than any other country, it has institutional experience that no other state can match. Submarine Flotilla Commander Frederick Linden perhaps best described the situation in an interview with Reuters. "We have expertise, which fills a gap, expertise that NATO doesn't have." 2 more submarines are scheduled for delivery in Sweden by 2028. This new type, called the A-26, will be able to launch remote-controlled or autonomous underwater drones to further increase intelligence collection and reduce risk to the crew. Sweden has a robust surface fleet too, with 35 fleet units in its active inventory as of 2024, according to the World Directory of Modern Military Warships. These ships are mostly light corvettes and offshore patrol vessels, but it will also bring 9 valuable mine warfare ships. At the very least, Sweden's entry into NATO adds to Russia's naval disadvantages in the Baltic. The Kremlin simply does not have the numbers or the firepower to compete with NATO's naval forces there, and it will not be able to do so anytime soon. NATO's combined navy has gotten much stronger with Sweden's membership, while the balance has tipped even more against Russia. For Putin, this is likely a big personal blow to his pride. Like many Russian rulers before him stretching back to Peter the Great, he has fancied his country as a sea power and has tried but failed to restore the Russian Navy's Soviet-era capabilities. Now Russia's access to the world's waterways is even further restricted, and it all came because of its latest dictator's own actions. But the Swedes don't intend to add to NATO only through air and sea power. Stockholm has every intention of doing so on land as much as it can. In that regard, the Swedes pledged to increase the size of their army by 30,000 personnel, with a 2025 timetable bringing the total up to 90,000. The 2024 budget includes investments in order to make this happen, such as increased appropriations for officer training. The new troops will be a welcome addition to the forward missions of NATO's multinational battle groups, which have been deployed in increased numbers to the countries bordering Ukraine since the start of the invasion. In the worst-case scenario, Sweden's bigger army will constitute a nearby reserve on an immediate call to help the beleaguered and outnumbered Baltic states. Sweden also has a reserve force of 32,900 personnel, plus 25,000 paramilitary troops. It has a total manpower reserve of 4.2 million. Overall, Sweden's military is ranked 29th in the 2024 list provided by the Global Firepower Index. In addition to its existing military technology and assets, Sweden has a robust arms industry, despite its traditional neutrality. This gives the country a good foundation to actually carry through with its stated intentions on building a modern military. It's in a much better position to rearm than Germany, for example, whose frequent pledges to increase military spending have always fallen short. Sweden's arms industry will also be able to help other NATO members rearm adequately, and thanks to its strategic position, Sweden can serve as a convenient nearby hub to manufacture equipment and ammunition, which the war in Ukraine has shown gets depleted at a staggering rate in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's invasion of Ukraine deeply disturbed the nations of Europe. It was disturbing enough for Sweden to end over 200 years of military neutrality, which prevailed even during both world wars. In fact, the last time Sweden entered an armed conflict was in 1814 with the Swedish-Norwegian War. Thanks to Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, that has now changed, and Sweden is arming once again. Historically, Russia was Sweden's greatest enemy, and Putin clearly recalled unpleasant memories for the Swedes, no matter how deeply buried they were. Putin may have wanted to weaken the transatlantic alliance through an easy victory in Ukraine, but his failure to scare the world with the Russian military might only have made his geopolitical disadvantage worse. With Sweden's imminent entry, NATO is now stronger, and the vice around Russia in the Baltic is all but closed. Russia is now at its weakest position there since the Great Northern War in the early 18th century. The Swedes under Charles XII lost that conflict, and Russia soon became the preeminent power in the Baltic. Over 2 centuries later, it almost feels like the ghost of Charles XII is finally having the last laugh. Russia's current dictator Putin may walk away from his war with some territorial gains in Ukraine, but for him, was it worth the balance of power tipping even more in NATO's favor thanks to Sweden's entry into the alliance? He can pretend all he likes that none of this bothers him, but holed up in the Kremlin, he probably isn't too happy about this development, to say the least. Meanwhile, Sweden is in a military alliance with all the other Scandinavian states for the first time since the Kalmar Union in 1523. Putin's aggression united the Nordic countries in a way not seen in 5 centuries. So much for weakening and overawing the West. What do you think about Sweden's accession to NATO? In what other ways might it alter European geopolitics? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out Why is Sweden preparing for war with Russia? Or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. It's February 2024 and a meeting is taking place in Paris. It involves some of the most powerful leaders in the world, the majority of whom are European and members of NATO. The meeting has two purposes. One, it gives all in attendance a chance to discuss Russia's recent advancements in Ukraine, particularly the taking of Avdiivka, which hampers Ukraine's efforts in the Donetsk region. What will those leaders do to shore up Ukraine and help it fight back against the advancing Russian troops? Secondly, the meeting is supposed to send a statement of solidarity with Ukraine, serving as a warning to Vladimir Putin that his invasion won't be accepted quietly. France's President Emmanuel Macron took both purposes a little too literally. While the rest of NATO members at the meeting tried to balance their responses, he said, "There is no consensus to officially back any ground troops. That said, nothing should be excluded. We will do everything that we can to make sure that Russia does not prevail." In the space of 3 sentences, Macron implied there was a possibility that NATO might send troops to Ukraine, marking a direct military action that it has avoided up to this point. The response was utter confusion among Macron's fellow NATO leaders. Several attempted to backpedal the comments on Macron's behalf, such as Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, who said there would be no NATO ground troops sent to Ukrainian soil. The United States sent an equally clear message, with the White House National Security spokesperson pointing out that President Joe Biden has been clear that the US will not send troops to fight in Ukraine. The small fire that Macron lit should have been extinguished right there. However, Macron, rather than walking back his comments under intense pressure from his allies, chose to double down. Just days after the meeting in which he made these remarks, he found himself at the Olympic Village France is building in Paris in preparation for the 2024 Olympics. Quizzed by reporters, he told them that the Ukraine crisis was a sufficiently serious issue. Every word he said was measured, weighed, and thought through, he said, suggesting that the idea of dragging NATO into Ukraine has been on his mind for a while. That brings us to the 2 questions we'll answer in this video. Why does France, and Macron in particular, want to enter Ukraine? And perhaps more importantly, will he be able to force NATO into the fight if he chooses to send French troops onto Ukrainian soil? To answer the first of those questions, we have to delve into France's military history. France has been considered one of the world's most powerful military nations. Napoleonic France, especially, saw the nation reach immense military heights, leading it to briefly ruling over a colonial empire that included large swathes of Africa. Expansion of that colonial empire continued through much of the first half of the 19th century, with France achieving key victories over the Habsburgs and Russia. Then it all started to fall apart. Perhaps overconfident following its latest victories, France appeared to underestimate the threat posed to it by Prussia. When the two nations went to war in 1870, France was defeated in a little over a year, ending any semblance of control it had over Europe while also paving the way for a united Germany to become one of the continent's major powers. It only got worse for France as it entered the 20th century. World War I brought with it another fight with Germany and a war that would lead to France losing 1,397,800 soldiers, along with 300,000 civilians. All told, France accounted for 25% of the war's deaths, second only to Russia, and was weakened even further militarily. When World War II came around, France was quickly overrun by the Nazis, with the country then having to rely on external allies and its own resistance movements to fight back against Nazi rule. It was another costly war. France recorded 217,600 military deaths and a staggering 350,000 civilian deaths. In less than 100 years, France had gone from being one of Europe's most impressive military powers to one of the weakest among the continent's major nations. Despite coming out on the winning side in World War II, France had seen 400,000 of its buildings destroyed, with 10 times that number being damaged, and was producing just 40% of what it had before the war in agricultural and industrial sectors. But there were some bright spots. Despite the damage at home, France had most of its colonial empire intact, at least for a while. Soon it would find itself fighting multiple wars overseas to try and maintain that empire, most of which it lost. It was this series of losses that led to France focusing on rebuilding its army while creating new relationships within Europe. In 1957, it became a founding member of the European Economic Community, which would later evolve into the European Union, or EU, showcasing a desire to build through collaboration. The country was also a founding member of NATO, again setting itself up as a team player in an organization designed to keep the peace. France wished to position itself as a problem solver, a peacekeeper, and to do that, it would have to back that positioning with a stronger military. That brings us to today. According to Global Firepower, France has the world's 11th strongest military. Its army has 200,000 active personnel, with another 26,000 in reserve, and it maintains plentiful stocks of aircraft, naval vessels, and ground-based equipment. It's also a nuclear nation, one of only 9 in the world, with a stockpile of 290 nukes that make it a clear threat to any other country on the planet. But now you're likely asking yourself what any of this has to do with dragging NATO into the Ukraine war. This brief history highlights how France went through an extended period of military humiliation only to pull itself back into a position of geopolitical importance. It did that by forming alliances and rebuilding its military, and it did it knowing full well that an aggressive nation that goes unchecked not only presents a threat to the country it invades, but can go on to threaten many more. It saw that in World War II, when Germany took Poland and went on to dominate most of Europe before the Allies found a way to fight back. And perhaps Macron is seeing something similar occurring in Russia and Ukraine today. He may see the war as the starting point of something much larger, with his comments about sending NATO troops into Ukraine being intended to show that France would fight against Russian aggression. He may also have wanted them to serve as a reminder to his NATO allies that fighting against such a threat would require a unified show of force, allowing him to argue for all of NATO to get directly involved in the war. Plus, by being the driving force behind NATO involvement, Macron would stand as the first person to suggest direct action in Ukraine. France could emphasize its position as a peacekeeper and gain more power on the geopolitical level. But those reasons are speculative and far from the only possible reasons behind Macron's statements. It's also worth pointing out that France faces plenty of problems at home that could have caused Macron to suggest NATO action in Ukraine. He's dealing with a nation in crisis over immigration. According to the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations in New York, France is currently home to around 700,000 asylum seekers and refugees. It's also a heavy contributor to the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, contributing about $100.6 million to the organization, which all again feeds into this image of France as a nation building itself up through helping and cooperating with others. The problem is that the country has a significant far-right contingent that opposes such heavy immigration. In January 2024, Macron unveiled a controversial bill that was immediately made law that implements a host of measures intended to curb immigration in the country. That bill makes it more difficult for those who move to France to bring their family members along with them, as well as limiting access to welfare benefits. Worse yet for immigrants, any children they have in France would no longer automatically become French citizens under jus soli, or right of the soil, and instead will have to apply for citizenship at some point between the ages of 16 and 18. The bill has prompted mass protests in the streets of France, with 16,000 people marching in Paris in the immediate aftermath of its publication, with 75,000 in total protesting nationwide. It's also worth pointing out that France has taken in fewer Ukrainian refugees than any other nation in the European Union. Of the 4.3 million people who have been displaced by the war, France has only accepted 64,720. That pales in comparison to Germany, which has welcomed 1.2 million refugees, and Poland with 1 million. All told, France welcomes fewer than 1 Ukrainian refugee for every 1,000 citizens, compared to many EU countries that are welcoming 25 for every 1,000. What does any of this have to do with France and NATO entering Ukraine? It shows that France is currently a divided nation. With his comments in February, Macron may have been attempting to distract from the problems the country has internally, instead shifting the focus away from his controversial policies toward a common enemy, Russia. Plus, he could always make the argument that tackling Russia now would mean France faces less pressure to take in Ukrainian refugees, which would be a win with the far-right elements of his party as far as he's concerned. So we now have 2 possible reasons for Macron to want to get involved in Ukraine. France's history, especially in terms of falling victim to aggressive European powers, may play a role, as could the country's immigration crisis. But there are other issues at play, namely the Wagner Group. That group is an interesting example of how the Russian military works. In addition to the country's main military, it also funds and supports the activities of several mercenary organizations. The Wagner Group is perhaps the foremost of these organizations, with the group technically operating independently of the Russian state. But in reality, it's often used in operations designed to enhance Russia's influence around the world without Moscow and its military having to get directly involved. Operations like its recent activities in Africa. We mentioned earlier that France used to have a colonial empire that covered much of Africa. Though the nations it controlled are largely independent of France today, many are still influenced by French culture. A large portion of the 700,000 immigrants living in France today come from its former colonies, and there's even a name for the system that France uses to engage with its former colonies, the Francafrique. For decades, Francofrique has enabled Paris to maintain some levels of influence throughout Africa. But thanks to recent actions by the Wagner Group, among others, that influence is on the wane. Take what happened in Mali in May 2022 as an example. For 9 years, France had stationed a military contingent in the country to help it deal with threats of Islamic terrorism and rampant instability. When those troops arrived, France was hailed as the hero that would save Mali. Again, we see France's desired role as the peacekeeper come into play. And for a while, Operation Barkhane, the name France used for its activities in Mali, was a success. France helped to train the Malian army, particularly in the use of air and ground technologies, helping to strengthen the country against the various threats it faced. Unfortunately for France, the Sahel, which is seen as a hotbed of Islamic insurgency, was a problem that it was never able to solve. Since France entered the country, Mali has seen 2.5 million of its citizens displaced, along with thousands of military and civilian casualties. The relationship between France and Mali began to sour in 2020. 2 years later, Macron ordered all 2,400 French troops stationed in the country to withdraw, essentially leaving the Malians to their own devices once more. Except that's not what happened. Instead, the Wagner Group stepped in to fill the vacuum left by the departure of the French soldiers. Universidad de Navarra suggests that Wagner's deployment in the country began in December 2021, 6 months before France's withdrawal. The group quickly established relationships with Mali's military junta, essentially creating Russian influence in a country that was previously supported and influenced by France. But that's not all. In addition to withdrawing troops from the African continent, France has had to deal with a constant campaign of disinformation related to its actions there. For instance, March 2023 saw a video begin circulating on the web that showed armed men storming a gold mine in the Central African Republic, or the CAR, and killing 9 Chinese nationals. In the video, a rebel fighter from the CAR is seen proclaiming that the French want to drive Wagner out of Africa. Alarm bells rang in Paris. The implication from the video was that Paris had ordered the storming of the mine, perhaps intending to use the murders to discredit its Russian rival and strengthen its influence in the CAR once more. It's unlikely that was the case, with Reuters suggesting that the video was part of a concerted campaign of disinformation and Russian propaganda designed to paint France as the villain in the eyes of the wider African population. And it worked. While it's inaccurate to claim that Francofrique is no more, it's certainly less effective today than it was even a decade ago. And therein lies another reason why France might want to enter Ukraine. It sees that it's losing influence to Russia. Where the Wagner Group has helped to strengthen Moscow's influence in Africa, the Russian military is looking to do the same in Europe. If Russia takes Ukraine, then the obvious question, at least in Macron's mind, is who's next. After all, Macron has seen Russia advance in Ukraine. Though Kyiv enjoyed some early success in the war, aided by financial backing from the West, it managed to push Russian forces back and cause serious damage to the Black Sea Fleet. It's been capitulating ever since. Its counter-offensive in 2023 ended in failure, and Russia has been able to take territory ever since. Avdiivka is a prime example, with the war increasingly looking like it will end in a Russian victory unless Western nations are able to intervene further. Taking Ukraine gives Russia more influence in Europe, and with that influence could come an emboldened Moscow. Next on the agenda, potentially Moldova. Though Moldova works closely with NATO, it's not a member of the organization. As such, Putin won't have to worry about triggering Article 5 of NATO's charter, as an invasion of Moldova wouldn't be a strike at a NATO member nation. But it would allow Russia to push further west, taking another slice of Europe in the process while expanding its influence. Chatham House suggests that Russia is already engaging in many familiar tactics to stir the pot in Moldova. The country's public information spaces are being targeted with disinformation, all designed to eat away at the country's social cohesion. Plus, Moscow is actively backing pro-Russian opposition to Moldova's president, Maia Sandu, with success meaning it could potentially turn Moldova into a proxy state. Chatham House calls this campaign of destabilization Russia's hybrid measures, and there's evidence of it in Moscow's attempts to influence the country's elections. In 2023, Moscow sent around $55 million into Moldova in an effort to buy votes and strengthen the country's pro-Russian groups. Moldova's National Security Service has even accused Russia's oligarchs of getting involved. They believe Moldovan oligarch Ilan Shor paid millions to stage protests in the country to further Moscow's agenda. All of this shows that Russia has a definite interest in controlling Moldova. And if it hasn't been able to achieve its goal through hybrid measures, its next step might be to try and take the country by force. It would have to wait until it succeeds in Ukraine, giving itself time to replenish its diminished forces. But once it's ready, it could use Ukraine's border with Moldova as the launching point for a new invasion. After all, Putin knows that NATO won't come to Moldova's defense with anything other than money and equipment. It's proven that in Ukraine already. Macron will also be well aware that many of the tactics Russia is using in Moldova are tactics it's already used against France. We saw that with the video that leaked from the CAR, with that piece of propaganda clearly implying France was responsible for the assault, and it's an issue that Macron increasingly has to deal with at home. According to Matthew Droin, a fellow of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, France has been a particular target of hybrid attacks, cyber and disinformation recently. This probably helped Macron come to terms with the reality of a more aggressive Russia. Perhaps that's what Macron means when he says that his comments about sending NATO troops into Ukraine were well thought out. He's already seeing Russia invade France, albeit in a non-traditional way, and he knows Moscow is gradually reducing his country's influence in Africa and Europe. Perhaps he sees this as part of a wider campaign that involves the entirety of NATO. After all, if Putin is so willing to target France, he's likely spreading disinformation and sowing seeds of discontent in other NATO countries. Finally, there's one other issue that could be pushing Macron to want to enter Ukraine: Donald Trump. During his current presidential campaigning, Trump has repeatedly claimed that he would withdraw the US from NATO if the other members don't start paying their way. That's a threat that much of Europe is taking seriously, even if it ultimately proves hollow. As Artin Dersimonian, a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, puts it, undoubtedly, concerns about a second Trump presidency have woken Europeans up to the fact that they need to do more for their own defense. He goes on to say that this realization may have given Macron the push he needed to work towards strategic autonomy from the United States. News outlet Al Jazeera appears to agree, claiming that Macron wants to advance a vision of a Europe that doesn't have to rely on Washington to support in defending itself. In that context, perhaps Macron's comments about sending NATO troops into Ukraine weren't directed at every NATO member. Instead, they may have been designed as a wake-up call to the rest of Europe about the need to present a stronger united front against an increasingly aggressive Russia. After all, the US may be Russia's biggest rival, but it's Europe that has to deal with Putin in its backyard. All of this leads us to a final question. Is it possible that France could actually force NATO into the war in Ukraine? If you listen to Macron's fellow NATO members, the answer is a categorical no. As we pointed out at the beginning of the video, most of France's compatriots were quick to distance themselves from Macron's remarks. Germany's Chancellor and the United States were joined in their denials that a NATO presence in Ukraine is a viable option by the UK's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. He said that Britain has no plans to engage in a large-scale military deployment in Ukraine, instead limiting itself to the people it has stationed there to help train Ukrainian soldiers. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was equally quick to issue a denial, with NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also denying that sending troops into Ukraine was a consideration. Ukraine isn't a NATO member, so why should it receive that level of support? Russia, for its part, had a field day with Macron's comments. Soon after they were made, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov was quick to point out that any such action would lead to a direct conflict between Russia and NATO. In that case, he said, we would need to talk not about the probability, but about the inevitability of direct conflict. The counter-threat was issued. And a month later, in March 2024, President Vladimir Putin made it clear that Russia had no intention to start a war with NATO. Speaking to Russian military pilots during a visit to one of the country's air bases, he claimed that any statements made about Russia's intentions to attack any other country in Europe after it wins in Ukraine were sheer nonsense. He called the very concept of Russia going to war with NATO ravings, in what was clearly a none-too-subtle dig at Macron. Putin used Macron's statements to undermine France's president, just as France believes he's using cyber and disinformation campaigns to undermine France itself. Still, should France choose to go it alone, would it be able to drag any of its NATO allies into the conflict along with it? That question is more difficult to answer. Macron may hope that his NATO allies would apply Article 5 of the NATO Charter to the situation. However, they wouldn't have to. Article 5 only covers attacks on NATO allies on their home soil. France entering Ukraine and subsequently being attacked doesn't fit that description, meaning Macron would be hoping that his allies would simply support his actions rather than being guaranteed their support. So where does all of this leave France in the context of the Ukraine crisis? Macron clearly believes that now is the time to involve NATO directly in the war. He wouldn't have raised the possibility if he didn't. He may see Russia's increasing aggression as an early sign that it has ambitions to take control of other European countries, such as Moldova, and may even believe that the crisis in Ukraine is simply the precursor for a wider war that could engulf all of Europe. To Macron, NATO has to nip that possibility in the bud now by asserting its dominance in the region and pushing Russia out of Ukraine. But there's also some self-interest at play here. France has increasingly found itself the victim of hybrid attacks by Russia, with Macron himself having been undermined by Putin in the wake of his comments. It's also seeing Russia's influence grow in Africa as France's wanes, giving Macron a geopolitical reason to want to quell Putin's ambitions. Plus, focusing his nation on war would help to distract from other issues, such as immigration, that are causing divides in France into which Russia's disinformation campaigns could feed. Whatever the case may be, Macron would have to do a lot more than simply send French troops into Ukraine to convince his NATO allies that they need to send troops of their own. And that's where we turn the questions over to you. Do you believe that NATO will ever enter Ukraine, as Macron suggests they should? How much of a threat, if any, do you feel Russia will pose to the rest of Europe if it wins the war in Ukraine? And do you believe Macron's fears of an ever-strengthening Russia are well-founded? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why France is preparing for all-out war, or click this other video instead.